Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Tisdale, Executive Director with Gridworks. It's our pleasure to be facilitating today's workshop and welcoming you here today. I will be very ably supported throughout this afternoon's workshop by a couple of Gridworks folks that I want to quickly identify. Maggie Dunham-Jordahl, our project manager, Neha Bazaj, our director supporting this project, and our senior fellow, Jay Griffin. Thank you three for all your help in organizing and supporting the workshop today. As we're clearing the waiting room and getting folks settled, we'll just go ahead and take care of a few housekeeping items. The first is to review today's objectives. Those are here on slide number 2 on the screen share. First is to update parties on the current proceeding scope, being the high DER proceeding. The Commission's aims within that current scope, what to expect in terms of next steps. Next objective we hope to accomplish is to share expert and party perspectives on the following question. What are the operational needs necessary to efficiently operate a high DER grid, unlock economic opportunities for DER to provide grid services, market power, reduce ratepayer costs, increase equity while supporting grid resiliency and making, helping to meet state policy objectives. We will also work on the objective of co-creating a list of operational needs that would be responsive to this question. And finally, laying the groundwork for the focus of our next workshop. What are the existing gaps and barriers in achieving the needs identified above within our current distribution system operator utilities? That's what we are setting out to do today. That's the work we're trying to accomplish. Next slide, please. Thank you, Maggie. Here's our agenda for the afternoon. We're going to move briskly through some introductions after we finish this housekeeping. Then we will be joined by Commissioner Houck, who's going to give us an overview of the Commission's goals, and then a presentation from the Commission's Energy Division staff about related proceedings and how they're feeding into this one. Item 3 on the agenda will be a presentation from Jay Griffin from the Gridworks team, just to introduce some basic concepts, terminology, and a little bit more detail on what we're trying to accomplish here and how. We aim to take a break at 2:05. Then we'll return for a series of panels. Panel 1 will include our distribution system operator utilities, as well as the CAISO. Panel 2 will be a group of thought leaders who we have brought from other organizations and jurisdictions that are dealing with comparable issues. And then last but not least, a panel of advocates, parties to this proceeding, who are going to share their perspective. We aim to begin wrapping up at 4:45 for a conclusion on time at 5 p.m. That's the agenda for today. Just want to remind folks and invite you to mute your phone so that we can have a quiet workspace. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. A few announcements. First of all, today's presentation and a recording of today's workshop will be available at the web link provided here. Next, we want you to participate actively in this workshop. Please do so by using the Zoom raise hand function. You'll find that in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. Participating actively in the chat bar, and as I will demonstrate in a moment, engaging through Slido, which is another way that you're going to be able to provide perspective and suggestions for us. We'll give you a demonstration on that in just a moment. Also want to note that you may have great ideas come to you after this workshop. We want to invite you to email those to us at the email address here provided by February 22nd. We would welcome that input by email, and if provided by February 22nd, we would include it within our summary of this workshop that Gridworks will prepare and distribute to the parties by March 2nd. Next slide, please, Maggie. So a few more notes on how to participate here. We're going to use the tool Slido to gather your responses to 3 questions throughout the workshop. First, beginning with introductions. Second, adding your comments to our operational needs wish list. And third, providing at the end of the workshop feedback to Gridworks and the commission on the process and the workshop. And as I mentioned, there's also several features here on Zoom that will allow you to participate. Use the chat to ask questions for our speakers. If they don't have a chance to answer questions verbally during the panels, we'll invite them to do so through the chat bar. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand in Zoom, and we will call on you as soon as time allows. And last but not least, just a gentle reminder to stay on mute unless you are speaking. And if we have background noise, we will just mute you ourselves. Thank you for your understanding. So how to use Slido is an important question for your participation here today. You can join in 2 ways. First is to use your phone or tablet to scan the QR code that's on the screen here.
Maybe I didn't. Let me
Excuse me. Thank you, Paul. Second is to go to slido.com and type in the code 7452931. That will give you access to Slido for your participation here. What we're aiming to collect in Slido is your responses to a couple of questions. Next slide, please, Maggie. The first of that question, and this is just a warm-up to get you used to being in Slido and participating in that way, is what is one thing you're hoping to learn today? So we use this for our introductions. We want to invite folks who are here today who plan to be active participants in this workshop. Though by active participant, I mean to say, you're going to raise your hand, you're going to participate, you're going to have something to say, to introduce themselves. And we will ask you to provide your name, your organizational affiliation, and enter into Slido a response to this question. What is one thing you're hoping to learn today? So I'll invite folks who plan to be an active participant to go ahead and raise hand so that we can call on you and move briskly through your introductions. And I'll just model what we're looking for. So I'm Matthew Tisdale, Executive Director with Gridworks. And as I've entered in Slido, one thing I'm hoping to learn today is what grid operators in Australia can share with California about operating a grid with lots and lots of solar. And I'm looking for hands to go next. I'll give you some more time to get your hand up. And in the meantime, I'll invite Jay Griffin to introduce himself and share his question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jay Griffin, Senior Fellow at Gridworks. Good to see you all. And what I'm hoping to learn today, I'm very interested in hearing from all the California stakeholders on what you see as your future for the high DER, particularly some of the advocates, what your interests are, and seeing the grid operators' perspectives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, so
all right, I'm not seeing any other hands yet, so I'm going to invite Commissioner Haupt to go next. Commissioner, would you like to introduce yourself and share a question with us?
Hi, good morning. Or good afternoon, I guess it's afternoon. Oh, is there an echo? I wasn't sure about I'm not sure what question. I really want to hear what people have to say and how we're going to ensure the operation of our distribution grid is meeting the needs of our 21st century clean energy goals.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. Jennifer Chamberlain, would you like to go next?
Sure. Jennifer Chamberlain with NG North America. I think I got out of this proceeding a little bit when I moved from CPower to NG. And so part of what I wanted to participate for today was to catch up with where we are. And I was intrigued by the study that came out last week. And so that's what I'm here to do. And I'm the Director of Regulatory and Government Affairs. So
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Glad to have you. If I'm pronouncing it right, Amin from Cal Public Advocates.
Hi, yeah, I hope you can hear me. My name is Amin Yunus. I'm with the Public Advocates Office at the California Public Utilities Commission, and I'm most excited to hear about the intersection between this work and all the other proceedings that we're going to hear about from the Energy Division staff, or at least that I think we're going to hear about related to rates, interconnection, and vehicle electrification, because those are things I think about a lot.
Great, thank you, Amin. Let's see, Chris King was the next hand I saw. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, similar to the last response, particular interest in electric vehicles and how they will fit into the IDR, DER picture, both from a V to B, V to building, V to home, as well as vehicle to grid. A lot of work to be done there on standards and regulations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Judge Himes, welcome.
Hi there. Good to see you, Matthew. I'm Kelly Himes, one of the 2 assigned administrative law judges to this proceeding. And I'm just curious to see how big of a universe we are talking about here, and how long it's going to take us to figure this out, to get to a point where we're going to be writing a decision. So I'm just curious about the plethora of answers that everybody else has.
Great, thanks, Judge Himes. Ariel Strauss, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ariel Strauss. I'm a regulatory counsel for small business utility advocates, and I'm most interested in hearing from the IOUs on limitations they perceive and their plans for addressing these issues. Thank you.
Fantastic. Ariel, thank you for being here. Anyone else want to share their question with us out loud? I see that we have good activity in the Slido field, so I'm glad you all are finding access to that. But if there's anyone else who wants to share your thoughts out loud before we move on, let's see hands. Minnie, go ahead, Minnie.
Good afternoon. This is Minnie Damodaran. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Yes, I'm from PG&E, and I will be working on the high DER OIR track 1, but I'm also interested in finding out, how this relates to all the other tracks. So that's the reason I'm here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Minnie. All right, let's do 2 more, and then we'll move on for time's sake. Roger Lynn, go ahead from Roger, can you hear us?
Yeah, can hear you. Thanks, Matt.
Great.
Roger Lynn from Center for Biological Diversity, interested in how we can maximize community benefits from DERs, especially for disadvantaged communities.
Great, Roger. Thanks so much. Good to see you again. Lucia, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, yeah, my name's Lucia Pullman, and I'm from the city of San Luis Obispo, and I'm most interested in learning how local governments can best engage in this process to support our communities in reaching an equitable, decarbonized future.
Awesome, Lucia. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Howard. Would you like to go ahead, Howard?
Yes, my name is Howard Gollop, and I represent the Port of Long Beach in this proceeding. And the Port of Long Beach is probably the largest transportation electrification facility subject to the Commission's jurisdiction. We are deeply concerned, and I would like to hear more about the exclusion of off-road vehicles from the staff reports to date. By off-road vehicles, I include vessels, and railroads and cargo handling equipment.
Great, Howard. Thank you for that. I'm not sure if we're going to be spending much time on that. That topic seems probably due elsewhere, but let's follow up with you, at least in the chat bar, to see if we can help you understand a better place for that. Maybe the Energy Division staff can speak to where that question is.
We've raised that issue repeatedly with the staff, and I do not think it should be not addressed. I think it should be addressed.
Fair enough. I just don't want you to be disappointed to learn that that's not on the agenda today. All right, so let's keep moving. The next slide, please, Maggie. Great. So at this time, we're going to turn the floor over to Commissioner Houck, who's going to help us understand the goals of the commission through this process. Commissioner Houck?
Okay, thank you. You can hear me okay, is that correct? Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Again, I'm Commissioner Houck, the assigned commissioner for the High Distributed Energy Resources proceeding. This proceeding focuses on planning and modernizing the electric distribution system to meet the needs of the 21st century. And I want to start by thanking Gridworks for hosting and moderating today's workshop in track 2 of the High DER proceeding. I also want to thank our Energy Division staff, Judge Himes and Judge Lackenpaul, for all of their work on the proceeding. We really wouldn't be here having these discussions without all the efforts they've put in. There are 3 tracks, as many of you know, in the proceeding. The first track focuses on distribution planning and execution process and data improvements. The second track focuses on distribution system operational needs and system operator roles and responsibilities. And the third track addresses smart inverter operationalization and grid modernization planning. Today, we're here for the first of the 3 High DER Future Grid Study workshops. These workshops are part of track 2 and will be held over the next few months to identify distribution system operator operational needs, assess where there are gaps, and develop recommendations to address those gaps. California's electricity system is undergoing a significant transformation on the path to reaching our clean energy goals. We are seeing a high penetration of renewables, the accelerated electrification of buildings and transportation, and continued deployment of behind-the-meter DERs. Given the steady growth in the adoption of DERs, this proceeding seeks to optimize DER integration within the distribution grid while making sure that the rates customers pay are affordable. We're focusing on making distribution planning and data improvements, including assessing the impacts of electrification on utility distribution planning processes and load forecasting to accommodate the high levels of DERs coming onto the grid. As we outlined in the amended scoping memo for this proceeding, this year we plan to host our future grid distribution system operation workshop series, of which this workshop is the first. We then plan to release a track 2 workshop report and issue a track 2 proposed decision after that. So the revised scoping memo for track 2 focuses on 2 key questions. What are the operational needs necessary to efficiently operate a high DER grid, unlock economic opportunities for DERs to provide grid services, limit market power, reduce ratepayer cost, increase equity, support grid resiliency, and meet state policy objectives? Is the first question. And the second one is, what are the existing gaps and barriers in achieving the operational needs identified above within our current distribution system operators, the investor-owned utilities? What are the potential solutions to overcome these barriers? So we will be assessing the current system which is operated by the investor-owned utilities in order to focus on near-term changes that may be needed for the grid of the 21st century. I want to stress that this is a starting point. It doesn't prevent us at a later date from examining other DSO models, but we really want to move quickly and ensure that we have a grid that's going to meet the operational needs to accommodate the deployment of high DER future that we're seeing. So I want to thank all of the panelists from the industry, the utilities, the community choice aggregates, CalISO, the advocacy organizations who have joined us for the discussion today, and all of the participants in today's workshop to get our series started. Again, thank Gridworks for all of their work. And I want to again thank Energy Division and the assigned administrative law judges. So I'm going to turn it back over to Gridworks and Energy Division to go through, and our Energy Division is going to, as our subject matter experts, will provide the overview of the grid planning, transportation, electrification, resiliency, microgrids, interconnection, distribution, and retail rates. I'll look forward to that. And just logistically, I wasn't sure if I'm supposed to hand it back to Matt to introduce the Energy Division folks, or if they're going to step in right now. And
I can help with that, Commissioner. Thank you. And
great.
just one quick follow-up question. You're planning on being with us all day, is that right?
Yes, I am. I may need to step out for about 10 minutes around 2:30, but I am planning to be here this afternoon to listen to the workshop, hear folks' thoughts. Really looking forward to the discussion and moving this effort forward. I know it took us a little longer than we thought to get it started, but it's great that we're all here and moving forward with it. So I'll turn it back to you, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you. It helps so much to have participation from our commissioners and judges. We appreciate you all being here. Okay, so I will turn the floor over to Woon, who is going to kick off the Energy Division presentation.
Thank you. Can you change it to the slide? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Woon Jung. I'm a high DR proceeding team member. In addition to Commissioner Hawk's remark, I will add a little more in-depth coverage of the high DR proceeding, which is a rulemaking to modernize electric grid for a high number of distributed energy resources in the future. Next slide, please. 3 tracks are under the high DR proceeding, and I will cover a piece. The left column in blue, track 1, focus on planning. It focuses on improvement to the distribution planning, execution process, and utility data portal. From track 1, we see a growing number of DER coming in the future, and many DER have export and import capability. This means we are facing a large number of bidirectional power flow in the grid, which is a challenging subject. The middle column in green, track 2, and the right column in red, track 3, focus on this operational challenge in the grid due to a high number of DR in the future. The difference between track 2 and 3 are track 2 focus on broader spectrum of grid operational management requirement of DSO, including DSO's role and responsibility beyond just the interconnection and management of the high DER. First, track 3 explicitly focus on the operational requirement of DER. In the other word, it focuses on leveraging advanced functionality to grid service by operationalizing smart inverter and DER. This workshop is for track 2. The next slide will cover track 2 more detail. Next slide, please. As the scoping go ahead. As the scoping memo is revised, utilities are the current distribution system operator, DSO. Here is the revised set of a scoping question for track 2. First question in the scoping memo, what are the operational needs of the distribution grid to accommodate a high number of DR that are safe, reliable, efficient to the grid, fair and affordable to all stakeholders, including ratepayer, while supporting California decarbonization goal. Today's workshop number will delve into this operational need. Second question's first part of a scoping memo, conducting a gap analysis of identified operational need from workshop number 1. First, the current capability of system operator managed by utility will cover in workshop number 2. Then second part, what are the potential solutions to bridge the identified gap from workshop number 2 and foster future grid development we'll cover in workshop number 3. Next slide, please. As a reminder, pursuant to State Assembly Bill 327 and Public Utility Code Section 769A, DER include energy storage, demand response, energy efficiency, electric vehicle and supply equipment. Due to this, several associated proceedings interact with the high DER future proceeding. As you can see from the bullet point, transportation electrification, microgrid, interconnection, and demand flexibility are among them. Therefore, first, it is important to understand the primary objective of this proceeding, and second, how they will be affected by high DER future grid operation. These 2 questions will help us determine whether high DER future grid operation will help or hinder their objective. 4 associated proceeding team listed in this slide will provide overview, more detail in the next slide. I will turn to Audrey. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you guys all hear me all right?
Yep, you're coming through, Audrey. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me today. My name is Audrey Newman. I'm a senior analyst on our transportation electrification team. And specifically, I oversee our work on vehicle grid integration and some of our work to help facilitate long-term planning for transportation electrification specifically, and how that coordinates with our ongoing planning efforts through proceedings like this one. Next slide, please. So for today, the proceeding I'm going to talk about is R2312-008, which is the proceeding that deals with transportation electrification policy and infrastructure. As I sort of mentioned a second ago, there's a lot of different points of interaction between these proceedings, between this proceeding and the high DER proceeding. But maybe I'll just start with a little bit of background here. So this proceeding opened this past December as a continuation and an advancement of our previous TE proceeding or rulemaking, the drive rulemaking. The goals of this proceeding are to further policy related to TE, including TE grid planning to support charging infrastructure deployment, behind the meter infrastructure investment to support state goals, vehicle grid integration, and ongoing TE policy development and collaboration. So for the purposes of today's discussion on operational needs for a high DER grid, I'll be talking specifically about the interaction with our work on vehicle grid integration. As a little bit of background, there's a lot of different definitions for what we mean when we say VGI. However, the Commission does have an adopted definition for VGI. So I figured I would just read that out right now as a little bit of a level set. We define VGI as any method of altering the time, charging level, or location at which grid-connected light, medium, or heavy-duty EVs or off-road EVs or equipment charge or discharge in a manner that optimizes EV or equipment interaction with the electric grid and provides net benefits to ratepayers. So what R2312-008 is trying to do in regards to VGI was preliminarily outlined in our preliminary scope in December. And so what we're trying to do is to establish goals and targets for the advancement of VGI, assess programmatic and policy interventions and affordability considerations with a focus on 3 areas, which are our 3 strategic focus areas for VGI. The first being technology enablement, and this is specifically not technology development, but how we are reducing barriers to the deployment of VGI technology. Rates and demand flexibility programs, so this will have to do with our coordination on setting price signals, and something that my colleague Cynthia will speak to a little bit more after I speak. And then TE grid planning. So this is specifically not creating new grid planning processes, but informing existing grid planning processes. And to Howard, to your point earlier, I think that's really the interaction between these 2 proceedings that probably more to do with track 1 of high DER. So the next procedural step for VGI within our TE proceeding is that we have a PHC or pre-hearing conference scheduled for the end of February. And following that, we will have a scoping memo. And the scoping memo will help to outline and advance our priorities on what this proceeding is going to aim to resolve on VGI. And in addition, if you guys are all interested, we have a VGI forum that will be announced shortly and will be held at some point in Q1 to discuss some of these interacting factors between different proceedings. So moving on to kind of the bottom of my slide here, what are some of the challenges and interaction points? I think, just to introduce this, these are certainly not the only challenges and they're not the only interaction points. Just a couple to highlight today. The first is determining achievable potential for V1G and V2G. So in order to determine the potential impact or benefit to the distribution system resulting from vehicles, we first need to establish some reasonable assumptions and expectations about how vehicles are going to behave, including for unidirectional or V1G and bidirectional V2G or V2B, V2X. This is really critical and a really critical first hurdle to overcome, as it will help us determine how best to prepare the operations of the system to handle EV load and at what scale. This is also very critical in terms of grid planning, however, not really the focus of what we want to deal with today. So one challenge now is that many different sources and processes have different V1G and V2G projections, and all seem to be fairly large estimations. And it's hard for us to plan our operations if we don't have a better sense of what to expect. So that better and more common understanding is going to be key to preparing our system. And then how we're planning to address this on the TE side, we aim to have a study through our contractors to help establish some of these assumptions, and then some of these results can help inform other utility and commission work in this area. The second item I wanted to talk about was addressing identified technical barriers to enable widespread deployment of VGI. So as I mentioned, we see one role of the utilities in this proceeding, in the TE proceeding, as technology enablers rather than technology developers. So what I mean by this is that we're identifying technical barriers to deployment, including third-party deployment of VGI technologies that help to reduce the impact to the system, shift load, or enable export to the grid. So through our OIR, we're going to aim to identify many of these barriers, including for automated load management and bidirectional chargers. And we expect more specific direction to come after our pre-hearing conference and scoping memo are issued. One current action in this area that's happening is through SCE's pilot on LCMS, or load control management systems, which is aiming to identify process and technical barriers to deploying third-party behind-the-meter load control management systems to enable flexible and incremental energization. And then the last one I wanted to identify here was just identifying price signals and incentive opportunities to encourage customer behavior. So one of the most critical roles that the Commission has in furthering VGI and helping vehicles serve as grid assets in addition to load is through price signals. Without the proper price signals, we cannot encourage drivers and fleet operators to charge and or discharge in a manner that reduces impact to our system, including our distribution system. So you're going to hear much more about demand flexibility and price signals from my colleague Achintia. However, we're working in very close coordination with Achintia and his team as they help to identify appropriate price signals that reflect cost causation, so not cost shifting. But the other goal is also to encourage drivers and fleet operators to charge or discharge at times that are beneficial for the system. This process is beginning with dynamic pricing and will be tested through our PG&E V2X pilots. But some key questions down the road may include how to differentiate by location on the distribution system to encourage, or if deemed appropriate, provide incentives for certain behavior. So lots of close coordination on these issues is going to be essential, not only between high DER and TE, but also through the other proceedings you're going to hear from after me. So thank you, and I'll hand it back to you, Matthew.
Thanks so much, Audrey. And next we'll hear from Patrick Saxton about similarly the relationship between the microgrid proceeding and work and the high DER work here.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Patrick Saxton. I'm a senior utilities engineer on the grid resiliency and microgrids team. Let's just go to the next slide, please. So there is no fixed definition for a microgrid, but for CPUC purposes, there is a definition in the Public Utilities Code. It's here on the slide. The main aspect of it is that the microgrid will both be capable of operating in parallel with the overall grid, and then also in a standalone or isolated mode. The other major takeaway I'd like people to have is that a microgrid does not imply any specific type of resources. So it's neither inherently clean or not clean, or, includes storage. Most of them will, but it doesn't explicitly have to. So it's a an agnostic word, and sometimes that gets lost for some people. Because of that, no specific topology or deployment. It's really all of these other proceedings that you're hearing about from Energy Division that can be applicable to microgrid. A microgrid might be one way to do all of those things. It may include elements of transportation, electrification, or it's definitely going to include interconnection. So it's really a need to coordinate and make sure that microgrids can participate and be part of all of these other activities. The current focus of the microgrid proceeding is to develop tariffs that allow community microgrids to use the utility distribution grid when it is in an isolated or islanded mode. That's another way of saying that a community microgrid is connected to multiple customers or multiple premises. Another current focus is implementing the microgrid incentive program, which is designed to support vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So a microgrid can provide all the functionality of distributed energy resources. It can coordinate with between the resources and loads, and then additionally, it's the unique thing about it is that it can also provide resiliency. I did want to note that in some non-microgrid scenarios, site controllers can also provide that coordination between DERs and loads. Because most microgrids will spend most of their time in grid connected mode, it makes all of these, ensuring that all of these coordinated efforts, makes that even more important. So specifically coming out of this high DER proceeding, that would be the efforts on developing additional markets and services. And those are all going to be broadly applicable to the DERs and loads within a microgrid. The high DER proceeding will basically take the lead on most of those issues. And then within the microgrids proceeding, we'll be making sure there's nothing that is conflicting or failing to enable microgrids to be able to use all of those services and markets that are being developed. A significant common theme between the two proceedings is standardizing regulatory requirements for things like eligibility, rates and tariffs, and definitions, and all of that will increase the feasibility of actually deploying microgrids. Next slide, please. So when operations and services are developed in the high DER proceeding, because the DERs and loads within a microgrid can access those, they're likely to become a source of blue sky revenue for the microgrid. And that will allow those loads and resources to meet both grid objectives and the microgrid objectives. And one of the main ways to achieve that is to make sure that the DERs and loads within the microgrid are treated equivalently to those outside of the microgrids. As an example, you may have storage within a microgrid that must maintain a minimum state of charge for resiliency purposes. That leaves an incremental portion of the storage, probably a significant portion of that storage that is available for market and program participation. So we want those rules and eligibility that are developed within this high DER proceeding to ensure that that storage can actually do that participation. It just makes it a critical path item to ensure that the eligibility and rules are correct. If we fail to achieve that, then it's unlikely we'll make efficient use of available resources, and substantive differences in those rules can make it much less viable for development of microgrids. That's all of my slides. Thank you, Matt. We'll hand off to Jose.
Thank you, Patrick. Jose, are you ready to go?
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Patrick. Good afternoon, everyone. Just making a sound check. You can hear me, correct?
Yep, we can hear you well. Good afternoon, Jose.
Good afternoon. My name is Jose Aliaga Caro. I'm a utilities engineer in the interconnection and distribution engineering team. Our team handles topics on interconnection, Rule 21, and energization, Rules 15 and 16. Next slide. As of yet, we do not really have a proceeding for Rules 15 and 16. Most of our efforts have been on interconnection. The objective of our current Rule 21 proceeding is to streamline interconnection of DERs. In particular, for generation, we're implementing limited generation profiles to allow greater use of existing grid capacity and avoid distribution grid upgrades. Most recently, a draft resolution on LGP was mailed for comments on January 21st, 2024. It resolved many issues. One of them includes the granularity of profiles allowed for the LGP interconnection options. We are still waiting for standards regarding scheduling to be
I won't
published.
be here, so.
Our team supports a high DR future by enabling faster interconnection. The SIO-WG's firm and non-firm capacity limits build upon limited generation profiles, and I will show that later. Some of the challenges we see are how to avoid the stranded capacity that is explained on the SIO-WG report, and upgrades to lower ratepayer costs. How to ensure upgrades are performed only when necessary, and what is the cost responsibility of those upgrades? To date, of course, it's been, the person who initiates the upgrade pays for the upgrades or ratepayers. But within our rulemaking, we've been exploring, a shared mechanism, and some issues still remain open. So we're looking forward to hearing from stakeholders and to mutual collaboration to resolve them. Next slide, Matt. So this is a conceptual illustration of limited generation profiles and non-firm capacity limits. It shows a 24 value profile per year for clarity, so it is merely conceptual. The 12 value profile was not adopted in the draft resolution. In this case, the limited generation profile is the firm capacity, the maximum a generation facility could export to the grid. The purple vertical lines show a possible non-firm capacity limits that would allow an LGP customer to exceed its export. Note, however, that this is not contemplated in the LGP draft resolution, but merely shown here to represent what the SIOWG report has, states. Also note that the draft resolution adopts 3 different LGP configurations, which will narrow down the margins of the non-firm capacity between the LGP values and the ICA static grid values. That is it for me, Matt. Thank you. Hand it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Jose. And last but not least, California demand flexibility. Achintya?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Achintya Madhuri. I'm a senior analyst with the retail rates team. And I work, I focus a lot on the demand flexibility rulemaking and specifically the dynamic retail rates aspect of the demand flexibility rulemaking, which I'll be talking about in the next few slides. So next slide, please. This rulemaking was launched with the goal to develop policies to achieve widespread customer adoption of automated demand flexibility solutions throughout the state, with the intent that these demand flexibility solutions, lower long-term system costs and have all the benefits of making electricity bills more affordable, enabling widespread electrification, and are scalable and can be adopted by both bundled and unbundled customers. There's also a twin goal, which is the CEC has adopted an update to its load management standards, which require all the IOUs and many of the large CCAs to offer optional dynamic hourly cost-based rates. So this rulemaking, this track of this rulemaking is deliberating on the types of rates, on how these rates ought to be designed and for IOU applications that would be CEC compliant. CC load management standard compliance. In terms of the tie-in to the high DR proceeding, some of the key issues are how can the IOUs utilize dynamic distribution prices to delay or reduce distribution system upgrades. This has been highlighted. The potential costs of upgrades has been highlighted in many studies. And so what are the techniques or what are the avenues for using dynamic distribution pricing to mitigate or alleviate some of those upgrade needs? And secondly, how can existing DSO systems be used to enable the type of dynamic distribution pricing that could indeed reduce long-term system costs? So next slide, please. In terms of what demand flexibility means, I wanted to highlight that this is from a staff presentation, but the idea being that as prices, which are more cost reflective, are sent to devices that have the ability to be flexible in demand, this can lead to a reduction in peak loads, a reduction in energy procurement costs, and most importantly, reduction in the required infrastructure that's needed to support an electrified renewable grid. So again, the idea is widespread adoption of demand flexibility can reduce peak loads, and this leads to reduced cost of service. Next slide, please. Energy Division staff has presented, has a proposal called the CalFuse proposal for how real dynamic pricing should be offered. And it's not just a rate design, it's a 3-pillar framework, which includes ensuring standardized price access, ensuring that dynamic prices convey not just real-time energy prices, but they also convey real-time capacity prices, including generation and distribution, and that these prices can be bidirectional so that imports and exports are getting appropriately compensated based on the real-time conditions. This framework also suggests that the IOU should include options for energy optimization. I won't be talking much about that, but these just wanted to highlight these as the key elements of the issues that are being discussed in the demand flexibility rulemaking. Next slide, please. So In addition to this proposal, CPUC has actually authorized many pilots, and most recently in the demand flexibility rulemaking, there was an expansion of the authorized pilots. There is a target for 150 megawatts of flexible demand to be enrolled into these CalFuse type rate type pilots in both PG&E and SCE service territories. And the idea is, again, this is conveying this slide highlights what the rate looks like on different types of days. And it's worth highlighting that the delivery price would convey the local distribution congestion to the customers, and enable response that could alleviate some of the local distribution congestion, which is a key part of ensuring that the distribution grid is also being utilized as effectively as the system grid could be utilized with more dynamic pricing. Next slide, please. ED staff in its recommendations has suggested that dynamic prices should be scarcity based, meaning that they are a function of load at any given point. So just as the capacity price for generation capacity or flexible capacity should be a function of the system load, the suggestion from Energy Division is that the distribution capacity should also be a function of local distribution load, which means that for prices to reflect that, that needs to be an input stream for the price generation part of dynamic prices. So the challenge for the high DER future: can existing IOU systems be used to enable the systems and processes for dynamic pricing? Currently, the CalFuse pilots are relying on third-party forecasts for generating distribution load forecasts. So potential solution that I think merits discussion is could existing data streams from the IOUs, existing SCADA data, be integrated with the price machine, that is the component that generates the prices, to enable the generation of truly load reflective prices on the distribution system. So that's all I have for my slides. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Ajinkya. That brings us to the conclusion of the Energy Division presentation. Thank you to you five for getting us started off right. You've given us a lot to think about. Folks, this is the context. This is the high DER context in which the conversation that we're having here in this proceeding is taking place. And we want to invite you to reflect on what you've heard here in these presentations from the Energy Division and what they lead us towards in terms of recommendations for new operational needs that the California operators can develop over time, capabilities they can develop to help meet the goals of these proceedings. You've all been active in the Slido, which is a great start. I want to invite you to go back to that space now. As you reflect on the presentations we just heard from staff, if you have an idea about an operational capability, operational need that you heard or would suggest, go ahead and bring it forward in that Slido column right now. You'll see that others are bringing ideas there, and it's going to amount to a good collection with your help. All right, so we are 2 minutes ahead of schedule. I want to check and see if there are any questions that folks want to pose for the Energy Division about their recommendations for the high DER proceeding. A couple minutes, we can take a couple questions. Brian Turner, go ahead.
Great, thanks. I think I would love to hear more about the limited generation profile, where that is at as a advice letter, and what would be required to get to flexible interconnection, right? Those are the limited generation profile is a very small slice of the capabilities that are available to something that is truly flexible and can evolve over time as the distribution load and capability evolves. So it's an invitation for what would be required to move from that, what we are currently discussing, to that future.
what operational capabilities would be needed to meet that vision for the LGP for the
It's operational, but also regulatory, right? We've got a LGBP that's based on 2 periods, I believe. And what would it look like to have a regulatory structure or a regulatory process to get us to a regulatory structure that could accommodate a truly flexible interconnection?
Great, cool. Thank you for that, Brian. As we feel our way through this conversation and try to help one another understand what's in focus here and what's in focus in other proceedings, I would say that the utility presentation that's coming up here shortly is going to give a fair amount of perspective on what they feel is necessary in terms of capabilities. And that is well placed here. The larger regulatory structures that are needed beyond the operational capabilities, I'll just let that be for the time being. I think that's going to go beyond what we take up here at the moment. But for the operational capabilities that we need the utilities to have, that's right here. And I think we'll hear more about that shortly. All right, I am seeing we have time for Mr. Griffin's presentation. And we will turn the floor over to you, Jay. This is going to be just a short 10 minutes, getting folks a little bit further oriented to the conversation here. Thanks. Go ahead, Jay.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. As Matthew said, I'm going to give a short overview of our 3-step process here and some of the basic terminology. So Maggie, if we could proceed forward. Just high-level overview of our process. Workshop 1 is focused on scoping question 1, which Woon went through earlier this morning. And our intended goal through the afternoon is to develop a list of future grid needs compiled through the work here and the thoughts of all the participants, as well as the discussion among the panelists. We're going to use that information as a fundamental part of looking at a gap assessment in the next workshop. And this focuses on the first part of question 2. Looks at where the gaps are between what's needed in the future and current operations. And workshop 3 is the second part of that question, or the second question, and really a focus on the recommended actions to the commission. Where does this lead to? Gridworks will compile all the information and the discussion through these workshops and into a report, the future grid study. So this is one of your opportunities to be a part of the record and to weigh in through your contributions here and how those are reflected and compiled in that study. I think as Commissioner Houck said, that'll be submitted to the commission and there'll be further opportunity for formal comment that the commission will take as part of their decision making. So we can step forward to the next slide. So this was a question that has come up through some of the panelists that have preparing their remarks, and the key part of the first scoping question: what are the operational needs of the future distribution grid? And I've started to provide an overview on this using conceptual model that Paul D. Martini has developed, and I think there's some good information that is reflected in a recent US DOE report that's cited here, discussing the evolution of distribution systems. And the basic concept here is that this can be done stepwise, or in 3 different stages here. And over time, as the relative amounts of distributed energy resources increase, the operational capabilities that the grid need to accommodate, and need to evolve to make the best use of all those resources. And when you look at some of the broad guidance on where you move from stage 1 to stage 2, in the US, California and Hawaii are really the 2 states that are on the cusp of moving from stage 2 into stage 3. And the work among this group here is really to define and identify what's needed to move to the very high level of this curve. And so the underlying premise is California utilities will need to upgrade their distribution system operations for the future grid. Taken an attempt using some of the literature here to define that and operational needs as newer enhanced capabilities that are required to reliably operate the distribution grid with high penetration of distributed energy resources. And our goal today is to really co-create that list with your input on what those needs are. We can step forward to the next slide, please. And just to give some overview and a bit more detail and context on what we mean by distribution grid operations versus some of the other items that may not be in the focus or scope of this proceeding. So very basically, distribution grid operations are safe, reliable, resilient operation of a distribution system. And really at its core involves two different functions. All of the complex operational switching operations that are needed to maintain reliable service in accommodating, scheduled maintenance activities that the utility needs to do to upgrade and maintain their distribution lines, isolating faults as they happen, and restoring service. So this is really a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes to isolate parts of the system and restore power that keep the lights on as best as possible during all the different types of events that can happen on a distribution system. So those are the complicated switching operations, but there's also the ongoing management of voltage and reactive power to provide service to all the homes and businesses to power our all the devices in our homes. So those are really the core functions, and what's increased over time are the needs to physically coordinate increasing amounts of distributed resources, potential for microgrid operations to ensure that those operations are still safe, reliable, and resilient, and coordinate all these new resources coming onto the system. And so I think this is broadly what we mean in scope for distribution operations. And what we're trying to leave out of that for now are activities related to distribution planning, market operations, and alternative system operator models. If we can step forward, Maggie. This is the last slide here, and I think this is try to give some flavor, some examples of types of future outcomes that we believe have been represented before and are understood to be of interest in a high DER future. And some examples of how you'd step through the three-step process here that we've talked about. So one future outcome that's already well underway are fully enabling community microgrids. An operational need that you could see to do that would be seamless transition between grid-connected modes and island modes for that microgrid, that both the microgrid and the distribution operator being able to do that. Current gap may be limitations on the IT systems, both at for the system operator and potentially the communications from the microgrid operator or controller itself. And the future solution or barrier, you'd want to inform the commission and the IOUs are providing scope and support for upgrading their systems to support that future operation. Broadly speaking, we're talking about transportation and electrification, looking at EV charging, at very high scale. Like there's been discussions underway about how to manage charging to avoid overloading distribution infrastructure in the near term to accommodate those fleet operations without needing massive upgrades in the near term. This is some of the information from the Smart Inverter Operational Working Group. There was discussion about communications needed from with the operator to schedule those charging activities on a more granular timescale. So moving beyond just a fixed schedule to things that could change on a weekly basis, daily basis, or even hourly. And those would be partly implemented through the recommendations from that report on improving load flexibility. So Matthew, that's a quick overview of the introductory material. That's all we have here. So we want to pause there, or I think we'd have a break plan next.
Thank you, Jay. We're just about ready for a break, but I want to pause and just emphasize here the purpose of the last 9-10 minutes is to really get you oriented to the process here, what's in scope, what's not in scope, give you a couple of examples of the type operational needs and barriers to meeting those needs and what we can do about it, just to help you sort of get on the same wavelength as what we think we're aiming for. And so we want to pause because if folks are disoriented to the process and what we're aiming for, or have a very different objective in mind, this would be a good time to clear that up. I'm comfortable with silence as a facilitator, but I'm going to interpret it as you're not clear on what we're doing. If you are clear on what we're doing, if you are clear on this process and what it's aiming for, give me some information to indicate as much. You could raise your hand and give that as an indication that you're understanding what's going on. All right, you got Amin, Sean, Byron, good. If you're not feeling this, say something. Good. More hands indicating understanding. Great, great. A whole bunch of people who are with us. Good. All right. Now this is like real human communication. It worked. All right. Let's give you all a break. All of you people who now understand and got your hand up, you're doing great. We want to take 10 minutes and come back at, let's see, that will be 2:15. And we will dive deeper, beginning with a panel with the investor-owned utilities and the ISO. Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you then.
Hey, buddy.
Okay, great. It's 2:15 and we have a lot of fun ahead of us. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I want to welcome our next 5 presenters, the panelists from the investor-owned utilities and CAISO. They are Devin Rouse from Southern California Edison, Quinn Nakayama from Pacific Gas and Electric, Kirsten Peterson and Christopher Franco from San Diego Gas and Electric, and Jill Powers from the CAISO. We have asked these panelists, as well as the others that will follow, to help us begin to explore the main question, the main objective of the workshop here. What are these operational needs and capabilities that we need to be developing to support a high DER future? Want to thank each of these panelists for putting thought to that and preparing these slides to help us get started. I'm going to begin by turning the floor over to Devin. And Devin, you can let us know when you want us to advance the slides.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, you can go ahead, at least one. Maybe one more, please. And so, yeah, thanks again, Matt. Devin Ross, as you mentioned, with SCE. I'm a manager of a group called Grid Strategy and Policy at Edison. And so really this topic is what I work on 40 plus hours a week, if not more. So, near and dear to us, and happy to be here and talk about it. So at a high level, we have kind of three components. Questions will be parked at the end of this panel, so skip that for us. But I'm going to cover kind of generally what we think success looks like on this topic. Quinn is going to cover probably a little bit more detailed around future customer grid needs, some of the technical components of that. And then Kirsten is going to come on and talk about the operational needs and sort of the evolution that we're already partway through. So next slide, please. You can go one more. Thank you. Yeah, so this one we wanted to start with, I covered this a little bit as I talked about Kirsten there, but we think this is a journey that we're already partway through, and really appreciate, Jay, your slide kind of covering that, right? And that advancing the distribution system has been a topic for almost a decade now in California. And we really do think that we're heading down that right path. But we do think there's a lot more change coming. That change does lead to new challenges, new complications, but at the end of the day, our role is still kind of the same thing, in that the electric system writ large provides a service to the society, and the role that we play as the operators is we really want a safe, reliable, clean, affordable. I'll throw in resilient because Jay had that one, we missed it. But all those good objectives, we think that that's the right way to operate the grid, and that's key central to the state achieving decarbonization goals at the lowest overall cost. In order to do that, historically, certainly at the distribution level, it's been very grid centric, right? So we talk about switching, we talk about controlling electron flow through the utility infrastructure. As we look at the future here, and we're already, kind of, again, partway through this, a lot of the change is around starting to leverage those customer devices further and further, and actually changing the electrons needed at those endpoints on the distribution grid, and whether it's bringing electrons from behind the meter in front of the meter, or routing, kind of changing the scale volume of them needed for behind the meter. Like that's some of the change in customer centricity that we're thinking about there. Third point kind of want to make here is we have been talking about DERs a lot in the past decade. We really do think transportation electrification is a pretty unique DER, both in terms of scale that we'll see, in terms of challenge, and that the nature of it being mobile presents a whole lot of challenges, but it also presents a lot of opportunities. You have ways to influence where charging happens, when charging happens, leveraging the discharge of those devices in given areas. So it's just kind of a unique DER that we really want to make sure is a focus for us. And I think it really dovetails well with the VGI topic we heard earlier in that proceeding. The one other note I'd make here is we talk a lot about DERs, and I think we have a footnote there at the bottom that energy efficiency is included, but I do think it's really important as we talk about the future of the grid, and it is part of this proceeding itself, is that load growth, sort of the need for electricity, is part of operating the grid too. So DERs in a lot of ways change the load needed. They change the tools we have to operate, but at the same token, we're going to see continued need for electricity beyond DER. So as a couple examples, right, I see it in the chat, there's a lot of mention of AI taking notes for people. Ultimately, there's a data center behind those AI tools, right? Those data centers lead to load on the system. So we're gonna have to be mindful of things like that present additional challenges beyond some of the challenge and opportunity that DERs present. And then the last kind of high level point for where we think we're going is, to date, the different voltage classes of the electric system have mostly operated independently. That's kind of where we use the fragmentation term. And we've also considered kind of different parts of our distribution system fairly independent from each other. But we really think this future we're heading towards is, in order to get to the affordability, in order to get to kind of the right outcomes at the right cost, it's all about orchestrating and getting kind of harmony from what customers are doing to what the grid needs to what the grid is doing, and really emphasizing that role that partnering across voltage classes, partnering with customers, partnering with other third parties. Like that's really the impetus for this DSO topic, and really getting that orchestration place is a really key tool for us. So next slide, please. And apologies, I'm going fast because I think I have about 5 minutes for my part. So on this slide, really wanted to highlight that, there are factors outside of the utility that are influencing a lot of what the change we're seeing is. So it's everything from technology to markets or new markets, climate change. I think everyone can appreciate that, especially if you live in Southern California the past week, pretty unique. And then policy is an important driver for everything we do. So on the technology point, obviously distribution system operation is a lot, in utility speak, it's grid management. So we are in our journey around advancing our grid management capabilities. And we really think that the ones we're doing are valid and will continue to be valid. And they're going to be needed. We'll need to expand them a bit over time, but we really think those are key in operating the grid safely and reliably. So using technology to advance our grid management is key. Addressing customers' growing needs, this is kind of the uniqueness of the graphic on the left. All these different factors can either impact, I like the wording earlier that now I'm going to forget, of hinder or help. I forget who said that, but one way is all these factors can hinder customers, but we really want them to help customers. And so we think of that as, how do you support customers' needs, their growing need for electricity, whether it's electrification or just sort of traditional load growing, really important part of operating the grid. And also, as I mentioned, climate change is one of those exogenous factors that's just going to change how the grid operates. It will change how customers operate, customers' demands for electricity. And so can't lose sight of the factors outside of our control and in our environment that will really also drive some change for us. Kind of third point here, again, I touched on it on the prior slide, but harnessing customers as partners is huge for us. So we do think customers will adopt a lot of technologies that present a lot of opportunities, and we want them to be our partners with that. So how do we help them make the right choices there? How do we help them use those technologies to make it a cost-effective choice? And then ultimately, how do we become partners with them and CAISO to orchestrate the grid and make sure that across voltage classes, across all the needs, that the grid will see that we really get the most value out of all the technologies that customers will have in the future. And last but not least, it was the first point on the first slide, achieving state policy is huge, right? Like that is what drives the utilities in a lot of ways. It's what drives the PUC in a lot of ways. And so we know that these decarbonization targets are ambitious. We know that they'll lead to a lot of change. And managing through that change is really critical to maintain affordability and improve equity, right? So we often talk about it at SE, at least. I'm sure other IUs do too. Like we can't leave people behind in this transformation. I think Commissioner Huck touched on it. This is a massive transformation. It's a transformation for everyone. We need to make sure everyone is part of it. So next slide, please. So again, what does it take to be successful? Technology evolution here. It is a huge part of the electric system technology. I love this fact. The North American electric system is arguably the world's largest machine. It is a technology machine, and it operates in ways that I think would mind boggle a lot of people when you really get into it, myself included. And so, we do need to continue to advance as technology comes out. We need to use it, we need to leverage it, and we really need to continue to implement some of the technologies we've been working on to advance. But then as we see new solutions, like again, VGI is a great example. When we talked about grid mod almost a decade ago, VGI was more a glimmer of hope in a lot of people's eyes, but now I think it's becoming really material. And so how do we make sure VGI, for example, becomes a really central part of our technology path moving forward? Policy advancement, big one here. How do you enable full grid orchestration, right? So what are the rules? How do you align and prioritize across needs? I know CAISO is going to speak shortly here, and Quinn's going to touch on this too, in that we see the challenges, whether it be load growth, voltage issues, climate change driven impacts. They're going to happen at everything from the smallest assets on our system all the way up to the bulk power system level. And DERs and customers are a good solution across all those, but there may be challenges of overtaxing customers and asking customers and DERs to do too much. So how do you sort of navigate through the right times, right places to use customers versus other technologies? That's just something we'll all have to think through. And ensuring that we have fair competition I think that's central. Probably don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it's going to just be important that we're enabling markets, we're allowing the markets to deliver, and we're not stifling competition. So a lot of policy space that's, I think, a lot of room for this track in particular to focus on will be good for us to explore in the future workshops. And then last but not least, the customer part of this. Again, we really do think customers are central. I keep saying customers is a broad, includes third parties, just to be clear. But we do think customers need to be engaged, informed, empowered. Vice versa, utilities need to be engaged, informed on what customers can do. And that's how we'll empower them. So it's a lot about learning about each other, a lot about partnering with each other and sort of working effectively together. And again, last but not least, certainly is how do we make sure equity is there? Disadvantaged communities, DER owners, non-DER owners, they're all part of the electric system. How do we give them all equal access, equal cost, sort of cost causation, cost allocation, whatever you want to call it? It's all part of this puzzle that, you know, customers are not homogenous. There's a lot of difference in each customer class, customer set. And as the 200 plus people on this call, I'm sure can attest to, like, each of us are different. So how does the grid account for that differentiation in people is something important for us. So that's the last of my slides, and I'll let Quinn take it from here and kind of deep dive into some of the more technical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. I really appreciate that. And hello, my name is Quinn Nakayama. I'm the Senior Director for R&D here at PG&E. I'll try to see if I can raise the energy levels a little bit here. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Why don't we go to the next slide? I think I have about like 7 minutes to cover like 2.5 hours worth of conversation here. So let's see if I can get through this. Really what we're trying to demonstrate here is, listen, we think that distributed energy resources are going to be a powerful force here in California and within all 3 IOU spaces to be able to really help with what's happening here in state policy to be able to ensure we can decarbonize at the lowest cost possible. And as you can take a look at these 2 graphs that you see on side by side, we think that behind the meter storage is going to have a large piece of this. But if you take a look at the slide to the right, like that is a crap ton of cars. And as we think about the plug-in availability of the cars over the next 30 years, you have this concept called anyways economics. You got to buy that EV anyways. 2035, every single car has to be an electric vehicle to kind of come off the lot. That is a lot of energy storage capability. That both is a load and a flexible load. Like you can figure out when you're going to charge these cars. But moving down the future, we're starting to see a much more serious industry taking a look at 2-way power flow technology, as customers are actually looking for being able to use their car as an energy resource, and not just to be able to, you know, minimize their bills, but we're seeing a significant push to even give them the capabilities to be able to back up their homes during grid outages. And now we're taking a look at that. And then since we're going to have the car anyways, can I use it for other things? The EVs, if you can take a look at the graph on the right, the growth pattern and the number of sheer gigawatt hours that are going to be on the actual grid to be able to tap into is going to have an overweight impact that really needs to be carefully considered. Next slide. All right, so this is an eyeful. I apologize, I get it. But what we really wanted to talk about is what are some of the use cases of which a DER may be able to really either facilitate the customer, support electrification, or support reliability. We try to put it in those 3 buckets. So really the first one is, you know, we'll take a look at these service transformers that are pole mounted surrounding our service territory. You know, there's a lot of customers who want level 2 charging at their homes, and we're going to see a much more bigger preponderance of that. However, we also know that L2 charging is flexible. Like when do customer charge actually makes a difference. And if they all charged at one time during the very peak of the day, that service transformer is going to be overloaded. But if we can figure out how to manage that charge, flatten that load, the service transformer may not be needed to be upgraded immediately as soon as a new level 2 charger just wants to come into play. Now, that has pretty big ramifications on adoption of a level 2 of somebody who wants to have an EV. If they're working with utilities and over suddenly they need to upgrade that service transformer, it's going to take 4 months, they may be more inclined to go buy a regular ICE vehicle. But if we can figure out ways to flatten out some of that charging so that service transformer doesn't need to be, you know, upgraded at that time, and we can weather through that, then what that enables is people will be able to access our grid with that level 2 charging need without having to do significant weight or cost. Now, there are risks and uncertainty of non-performance, right? If that doesn't happen, that service transformer may fail. And if that service transformer fails, well, then you have an outage condition affecting those 12 customers, 18 customers, and future customers who are going to be looking to try to get level 2 charging may now need to wait for a service transformer upgrade. That definitely has some impacts. Another one is this flexible interconnection process. You heard a little bit about this. And one great example of this is high-speed fast charging. High-speed fast charging is looking to put a 2 megawatt or 4 megawatt fast charger right at this particular location. And there are constraints on that grid. But when you really peer into it, that constraint may only occur during this particular day, in these particular hours, in a particular year. And really what you can do is you can set schedules, real-time day ahead type schedules that enable you to say, okay, well, I know you wanted 4 megawatts all the time, but tomorrow for these hours, maybe if you can just get 2 megawatts and be able to manage through the charging processes during that period of time, we can get you interconnected tomorrow, right? You don't have to wait for these long wires upgrades to be able to enable that capability. Now, some of the risks and uncertainty is that if we still do overload the circuit because of non-performance, then an upstream device will operate, and now 2,000 customers are out of power. That becomes a pretty big problem for us. So those are some of the risks of uncertainty and non-performance that we cover around the flexible interconnection. Another piece is, hey, we all recognize there's going to be heavy amounts of investment that are required for electrification. Don't get us any wrong. However, if we can figure out a way to flatten the load curves in certain situations, maybe those investments don't need to happen now. Maybe they can happen later. And that really will help for electrification load growth that we have. Now, the risk of uncertainty there is if we can't get that particular behavior, if we can't get it to be flat, then what ends up happening is maybe that new business that wants to come in, those new EV loads, those new data centers, they won't be able to interconnect because there's not really that capacity that we thought there was going to be on that line. And now they need to wait. And they need to wait for a delayed wires investment that could have been in place. But now that we've kind of pushed it out, if it's not there, and now they have to wait even further. And that really hampers the state's goals for decarbonization and even economic growth. And if it doesn't happen and it overloads the circuit, now we're talking about local reliability issues and power quality. So, there are risks for uncertainty and non-performance in this area that we just need to be aware about. They're solvable, but we need to be aware about them. On local reliability, we won't get into too much detail because this gets really, engineering focused, but we do have the ability to switch loads between circuit to circuit in order to be able to minimize outages for planned outages and pick up customers faster for unplanned outages. So really, we can maybe be able to call upon these DERs to be able to lower load and be able to perform more aggressive switching. And on system reliability, we're already seeing this. This is already something that's available. DERs participating in wholesale markets and being able to participate in things like ELRP to be able to shave off those emergency conditions to be able to meet those high peak demands on the system. Next slide. Now, one of the issues that we run into is correlation, right? The system doesn't correlate actually to the things that happen below it. It does in some situations, in most situations, but in other situations, it doesn't. You could get either zero correlation or even worse, negative correlation, where as you can see from the graph on the left, what you thought you needed from the system perspective actually is exactly the opposite of what you need at the local or the hyperlocal level. And this is where we as a DSO really need to figure out how do we orchestrate this all so that we can meet system and hyperlocal needs, and those areas that a conflict can be managed through so that we create reliability all the way from the hyperlocal all the way to the system. Now, we need more tariffs and policies to determine how exactly do we do this orchestration, and technology is going to be a big part of that. And as we move into bigger and bigger DER, EV related loads coming onto the system, this load profile may look significantly different at the distribution side than it does at the system side as we interconnect more solar, more energy storage, and more assets on the transmission side. Those profiles will start to really look different, and we need to figure out ways that we can orchestrate that appropriately to meet all customers' needs. Next slide. And finally, we really got to talk about this customer piece, right? I own a Tesla Model Y. Now it has a certain number of kilowatt hours inside of that, but how do our customers feel about using that car? It's one thing to say, well, let's figure out how you charge. That could have its own customer behavior related issues. But now you want to take energy out of my car? Energy out of my car for what, right? I need to be at work by tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning. That sucker better be filled up. If you're going to be using it for other things, how am I getting comfortable with that? We already have range anxiety stories that are occurring just on using the car for transportation. And now you want to use it as an energy asset. How do customers feel? How do they engage? How do they feel empowered in this world? It's something that is still unknown. And then the other piece is it's going to change over time. It's going to rapidly change over time, right? EV battery capacity is going to have some step change developments over the years. The availability of high-speed fast chargers is also going to have a step change availability. And what you might say is, well, customer behavior today versus customer behavior 5 years down the road may look significantly different. And so toward that, what we really need is two things. We need industry study. This is where, how do customers really interact with their car? How do they feel about transportation? How do they feel about letting go of their electrons, about controlled charging? And then flexible program design, because we realize technology is going to continue to evolve. People's feelings are going to change. And we need program designs that are not set and in stone for 5 or 10 years, but knowing that customer behavior and customer engagement will change over time as people get more comfortable, as technology gets better, that they may actually change their behaviors as well. So really what we're saying here is we need to do a lot of research to figure out what is the right way to engage it. Is it through rates? Is it dynamic? Is it locational? Is it one-time payment for X number of dispatches? How do customers feel? And how do we make sure that the way that we structure these programs is equitable for all customers, low income, the rich, live in the mountains, live in the beach communities? All of that needs to be factored in to be able to say, are we getting the necessary behaviors from these type of assets that'll best allow us to meet transportation electrification and the goals of the state at the lowest cost possible? So I was hoping I was able to run through that really quickly, and apologize to San Diego if I take too much time, but let's go ahead and move on to San Diego, who will wrap us up.
All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Kirsten. We're hearing you well.
Okay. Apologies. My webcam got switched to the other side. Okay, we can work with that. All right. Well, excited to be here with you all today. My name is Kirsten Peterson. I manage the control center over at San Diego Gas and Electric. So our team is responsible for the safe, reliable switching of SDG&E's distribution system. I have the pleasure today of co-presenting with Chris. You are muted, Chris.
My apologies, I thought I unmuted. My name is Chris Franco. I'm the team lead in the Electric Distribution Operations Control Center at San Diego Gas and Electric. I specifically supervise the DSO trainees and work with our training department.
Awesome. So Chris and I work closely alongside our distribution system operators, which has been interesting because it's given us a very direct connection to the opportunities and challenges within our current DER penetration on our system. So we're very excited today to speak to you about the operational needs that have been identified to meet customer expectations.
All right. We know operations were a bit simpler when the power flowed in one direction. As a utility, we were able to meet the needs of the grid and improve safety and reliability through investment in SCADA, sectionalizing, and planning and forecasting tools. Today, we're in a world of bidirectional power flow. To kick off this presentation, Devin shared that the impact from continued load growth and DER adoption, inclusive of transportation electrification, building electrification, net energy metering, and grid-scale batteries, just to name a few. What we're seeing today will continue to grow in scale and complexity, and these changes call for increased capabilities of grid management systems and processes. PG&E, SCE, and us at SDG&E need to operate and manage the complexity of an increasingly dynamic system, and in working with each other, we recognize that solutions are not a one-size-fits-all. What we all agree on is that as IOUs, we have an obligation and desire to enable the high DER and transportation electrification grid with providing the same or better safety and reliability. Next slide.
Now, I want to elaborate a little bit on what capabilities these operational needs are calling for. So as you can imagine, the growing complexity of the grid, this brings the utility and distribution system operator a large amount of assets and data. This is a lot to monitor, assess, analyze, manage. And situational awareness has always and continues to be foundational to the success of distribution system operations. So with this increase in the number of assets and the data coming in this high DER space, this really creates a challenge for visibility and for modeling for this future volume. So not only is there a need to digest this data, to analyze this data, but it's also really important that all of the estimated impacts are displayed and available in a way that's meaningful. So a format that allows for successful daily operations. So one example of this is being able to differentiate masked load from the net load that we might be viewing in a high DER space. So we view this data, these tools as something that needs to be like an operator assist rather than a barrier to operating the system. Another foundational capability that we want to pick out is being able to establish reliable and appropriate architecture for operational needs. So we need our communications to be reliable. We need appropriate telemetry control, which really enables scheduling, load management capabilities. And we want to make sure too that this architecture is streamlined from all the way from the grid edge to that control center, operations center. So finally, to this point, as Quinn mentioned, the capability to balance needs across different operating levels will also be crucial as in the evolution of the grid. So this grid orchestration really builds upon the data, the analytics actually being actionable. So even with our current volume of DERs, we've already started to see the needs for calculating dynamic ratings, dynamic charge limits, and the ability to detect problems in advance, such as potential overloads. So next slide, please. And to close out, to mention too, at the end of our presentation, we do have a summary that dives deeper into those points and where we recognize there is a need for more development. So we can hover on that at the end. In addition, those of you all have access to the slides and can reference it. You can stay on that slide, sorry.
Yeah, I think, yeah. All right, so you've heard the term orchestration. It's been used throughout this presentation, and it is an appropriate word for operating on the grid of the future. Regulatory requirements, contractual issues, the needs of the bulk electric system, and the needs of the distribution system need to be coming in at the right time, prioritized or deprioritized depending on the situation, all while being prepared in the case of emergencies or system events. When conflicts arise, where will the deconflicting take place? This may be in the grid system. And here it is especially important to reiterate maintaining the customer experience and reliability, which would require the capability to prioritize lower level needs over higher level needs when conflicts arise. All right, and next slide, please.
And so we want to close out this presentation by touching on an identified need that very much requires joint collaboration, asking the right questions. So what will be the individual customer's role in the high DER future, and how will they participate? The past customer was a passive participant to rates, reliability. Future customer may want to play an active role balancing energy needs, becoming savvy to the technology that makes the most sense for their situation. So how do we support them? We'll need to make sure a framework exists to communicate broad participation opportunities that clearly defines expectations, explanations of requirements, enrollment, any economic incentives. And we really feel this tees us up to workshop number 2, where we are going to look forward to addressing identified gaps that exist for us to achieve these operational needs for the successful high DER future. So we definitely appreciate all of your time to discuss this. We can go ahead and click a couple slides forward to our appendix slide just to land on our summary. And with that, we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for the audience for questions or comments.
Great. Thanks very much, Kirsten, Chris, Quinn, Devin. First, we're going to hear from Jill, California Independent System Operator. And then if some time is available, we will take questions. Folks have questions, clarifying or otherwise for the utility presentation, go ahead and log those in the meeting chat now so I can help get them fielded. Jill, are you ready to go?
I am ready. Yes, we can move forward. My name is Jill Powers. I am with the California ISO. You can hear me great, right? I'm not double muted or anything. Okay, good. Yeah, so Jill Powers, I work in our market policy and development group. I am a sector manager for this specific topic, demand response and distributed energy resources. And you know, I didn't get a chance to review the utilities presentation for today, but I think it's great how Gridworks has set this panel up. Because it really shows a bottom-up approach to identifying the operational needs. Because my presentation will really be looking at it from a much higher level, somewhat higher level, and really representing, you know, all of the operational needs that are happening down. And the ISO recognizes there's a lot of operational coordination that's going on just within the distribution system before it actually comes up to that operational coordination needs between the utilities and the ISO. So if we move to we can move to the next slide. It's really just providing a perspective. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but providing a perspective of how the ISO is considering the variety of different scenarios under which DERs will be operating in the future. I think we've discussed that here today. Presently, the ISO is really kind of focused on these 3 broad use cases presenting themselves, and really preparing to continue to manage the grid reliably and to operate the grid under these different types of scenarios. And this includes DERs responding, as we heard earlier, to signals that may be grid informed through the dynamic rates and flexible load options, and controlled in a way that meets those individual customer needs. We're also anticipating growth in aggregations of DERs that just act as virtual power plants, that they can participate directly in the ISO's wholesale markets and provide transmission services, or they're going to be dispatched as needed by the distribution system operator, or even just being utilized by the customers in the manner that they deemed most fits their needs. And lastly, we expect to see a continued growth in DERs that just will operate independently. They may be somewhat inflexible, and they're not going to be responding to these external signals, maybe not even rates, or not through any dispatch signals. So these are the scenarios in which we understand that there's going to be need for. We'll go to the next slide. They're going to impact the ISO in different ways, and we're going to require different transmission and distribution operations collaborations, as well as system advancements in order to be able to collaborate in the ways and coordinate in the ways that we need to. And we've kind of identified three specific areas in which we would like to see advancement. We know we need to see continued collaboration, and we're going to ultimately need direct coordination with distribution system operators in these areas. And I think the utilities brought many of these up. The DER visibility and also for situational awareness. We need to have this coordination for reliability purposes, and we need advancements in communication as well as data sharing. And if we go to the next slide, I want to kind of give a little bit more about coordination of the visibility of DER information as needed. And we need to understand what DERs and where the DER is, because we do anticipate their impacts. We will see impacts on transmission system grid operations. I know it's a pretty broad statement, and we'll need to kind of work on defining all those specific data needs, but we have some ideas on what that would look like. Pretty much like large-scale resources, it's critical to have resource-specific information such as location, technology type, capacity values, minimum and maximum, what kind of system monitoring on these, different customer types. So these are the type of information we've already kind of started to identify as being needed. And why is it needed? Well, it's needed for planning, for forecasting processes, and to really improve the grid asset utilization as we use it for short-term load forecasting accuracy, and this will go into our ISO market optimization and dispatch. So I have kind of in the red the need for operational forecasting data. We need that data to understand how DERs are acting and how they're responding when they are dispatched. The next one is just kind of an identification of that situational awareness that's needed, because with greater visibility comes greater operator situational awareness of both the DERs that are participating in the markets and providing services, and those that aren't participating but yet supplying load. So just as an example, I threw up here what we've seen from behind the meter solar and how it's been the most impactful DER. And again, these are non-participating DERs for the ISO operations standpoint thus far. We've seen, rapid movement of demand actuals when we see this DER that is supplying that load generation drop off. And this is due to the forecasted cloud coverage that's coming in. And that's why there is this need to understand where these are, what is there, the capacity that is out there on the system, the distribution system, because impacts like that, the 725 megawatt increase in load, does now percolate up to needing some being impactful to transmission operations. So it's important to understand the impact of all types of DERs, not just the solar, which is our most impactful to date. And we need to understand this under a variety of different uses for reliability purposes. And I think Quinn touched on this expectation of transportation electrification. We think now that's going to move that, advance that forward to some of the most impactful things that we'll be seeing on the grid, and it being, bringing greater complexity to the need to have that visibility and to do this forecasting of what we might see in operational timeframes, so that our operators do have that situational awareness. And the third item, we'll go to the next slide, really just on the overall reliability coordination between distribution system and the transmission system, recognizing that the ISO does not model the distribution system. We can't ensure resource dispatch through a wholesale market award or control through our EMS system. Providing those type of services is safe or even feasible to the distribution system. So we have to have some real-time type coordination as to feasibility of resources, distributed energy resources that may be providing transmission services. Additionally, again, brought up the fact we have to anticipate how the operation of non-market participating DERs may impact the transmission system. So what's needed within the reliability coordination umbrella, really a framework to coordinate the operation of these DER resources when they're providing services not only to the ISO bulk electric system, but also if and when they become providing services to the distribution system. And really the coordination is to ensure that there is feasibility of those services and to preserve reliability. And last of the three items, beyond the initial visibility into the deployment of DERs of where and when, there's a growing need for communication of the operations of or the restrictions to operations of DERs within those operational timeframes that we tend to look at, the day ahead, real time, leading up to the provision of services. Really needing the communication between the grid operators, not just the grid operators, but also between the operators as well as aggregators and our scheduling coordinators. So what's needed here is that communication platform, information sharing framework. I think it was touched on as really this orchestrated system, the system that is orchestrating this type of communication between the operators in the appropriate time frame, giving status of DERs, the feasibility, their activity in relation to grid operations for reliability. So lastly, I think this is just a summary, and I think I've touched on all of these different aspects of why we need advancement in these different areas: visibility, reliability, communication, advancement in the process, potentially advancement in policies, as well as we definitely see advancements needed in system and system orchestration of this type of information sharing and coordination. So that's it for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill, for getting us finished on time. We have 2 minutes before we're going to move on to our thought leaders panel. And that is a hard stop for us. We have some special guests calling from abroad, and we want to be respectful of their schedule and time. But there are a number of questions that have been shared for both the utilities and the ISO in the chat. So I want to invite Devin, Quinn, Kirsten, Jill, please scroll through the chat. And if you see a question there that feels addressed to you, if you have a chance to respond to it, feel comfortable responding to it in the chat, go for it. And then if we have a little bit more time later in the afternoon, we may come back to raise some of these questions for discussion with you all. But we will wrap the panel for now and say thank you to you five again for the hard work you put into preparing for this panel and sharing these good ideas with us. All right, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you to let us get started with our thought leader panel.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I just want to check in with my co-panelists here, make sure we have everyone online and on time. In the meantime, I'm going to do short introductions. We're very honored to have, actually, I think I've calculated we're spanning about half the globe in time zones today. We have folks on the East Coast all the way through the West Coast and throughout the Pacific here on this panel. We're honored to have Jenny Reese, who is the manager of the Operational DER Management Department from the Australian Energy Market Operator. She has a great presentation prepared, and I think will highlight for folks here the art of the possible, where California and other parts of the US are headed. They're already taking on these challenges today in Australia. So we'll see some of that. Next up will be Brian Hannigan, the president and CEO of Holy Cross Energy in Colorado. It's a member-owned cooperative in Colorado. Brian will be sharing his utilities plans for high DER future that's well underway already. And we also have Debbie Liu, who is the Associate Director of the Energy Systems Integration Group, who has been a long time analyst of renewable systems integration. We'll be offering perspectives from ESIG and experiences in the United States with high DER operational needs. I think we're going to move through each presentation, and then if people can place their questions in the chat. And again, we want to refresh opportunities to share your thoughts on operational needs in the Slido app. We'll save the discussion for at the tail end of the 3 presentations. So if we can first move to Maggie, if we can move to Jenny's presentation. I believe we have Jenny, so thanks for joining us.
Just confirming you can hear me, Jane?
Yeah, coming through loud and clear.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be with you this morning for me. You just jump to the next slide, please. So just briefly about us at AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator. So we operate the electricity grids on the national electricity market on the whole east coast of Australia, as well as the wholesale electricity market on the west, and also operate the gas markets. And I'm going to talk to you a lot today about the experiences in the NEM on the east coast of Australia. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of context for scale, this shows you Australia overlaid on the United States, and I've put California there. I'm going to talk to you a lot about the South Australian region, which I've circled down the bottom there. That region in geographical scale is not dissimilar to California. But much smaller electrical load. It ranges between about 1 to 3 gigawatts of underlying load in that region of the grid. It is connected synchronously to the rest of the national electricity market, but only relatively weakly through one double circuit AC interconnector. And that interconnector can be lost and in unplanned outages on occasion. That's typically happened in the past, maybe once per year or so. We'll have a double circuit loss, and we have to operate South Australia as an island synchronously on its own. Next slide, please. This is showing you the levels of distributed photovoltaics that we've got to in South Australia. So just recently on New Year's Eve, 31st of December just gone, we reached a new record where the total net demand in South Australia was negative 26 megawatts. So that was 102% of the demand in South Australia supplied by distributed photovoltaics, by which I mean rooftops, essentially. We're talking 5 kilowatt rooftop systems supplying more than 100% of the demand in the grid in South Australia. That means it's backfeeding from the distribution network and supplying industrial loads. We have a number of large mines and other industrial customers in South Australia, all of whom were being supplied by those mums and dads rooftops, up to about 1.2 gigawatts of total demand there. So historic record and a lot that we've been learning from looking at this day. Next slide, please. So I've just summarized on this slide a number of learnings to date, I guess, or things that I would reflect on if I was starting afresh in terms of working towards achieving successful operation with really high levels of distributed PV. And many of these are issues that we're continuing to work on. The first one there, really underpinning everything, is the technical performance standards, particularly making sure that we have appropriate standards in place for disturbance ride-through capabilities. We found that we did not in our previous 2015 version of the Australian standard, so we had quite a process to update that and get that out in the field. We've then since found that compliance with that new standard is very poor. So very important to measure and ensure suitable compliance with the standards. It's been quite a process since about 2019 and still going to try and get those standards applied and properly compliant in the field. Number 2 is around dispatchability. So we raised the alarm bell relatively early on, back around 2017 or so, noting that we were going to hit periods where we were supplying almost all of the energy across the grid from distributed photovoltaics, and that in order to manage those periods, especially under outage conditions, it would be crucial that we can manage the active power from those distributed resources, and that at the time there was no ability to do that. It's been quite a long journey to get that capability in place. We now have that, what we call emergency backstop capability, to be able to curtail active power from mums and dads' rooftops at scale in South Australia. And we're working on that across the rest of the grid as well. Longer term, we'll be iterating towards integrating distributed photovoltaics into our scheduling and dispatch systems, so that we can develop all of the more sophisticated capabilities that we'll need longer term. But that's very much something where we're trying to start simple and learn by doing, just getting some simple capabilities in first, and then iterating towards more sophisticated integration. Third is around visibility, and making sure that we've got adequate data that can then feed into developing adequate power system models. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the data sets that we've needed, but really crucial to think about that early and start collecting them and make sure they're accurate, because we've had a lot of problems with poor data quality. We're also seeing a need for roles and responsibilities evolving. One of the really key ones that's come out is that the original equipment manufacturers are really critically important. We're spending a lot of time engaging with them in ways that we would not typically. Normally, we'd be working with market participants who have responsibility for their assets, and if needed, they might go back to the manufacturers to ask for further information about their equipment. But we're finding as system operator, we're now dealing very much directly with those original equipment manufacturers, because essentially there is no market participant who's offering bids and engaging with us as the system operator. So that's causing a lot of challenges, given that that role is not entirely clearly defined and not something that they're used to fulfilling. Also challenges around things like customer metering. There's a device at every customer site that's highly capable of delivering a lot of functions that we need. A lot of these new capabilities are technically possible, but customer metering has never been used in that way before, and there's a lot of governance challenges around unlocking those capabilities. The final one there is around cybersecurity, which is definitely a growing concern, and one that we're continuing to work through how we address that. So I'll touch on that. That's sort of your summary of all of the high level. I'll touch on some of these in a little bit more depth with some examples. If we can jump to the next slide. So firstly, this underpinning capability of disturbance ride-through, we discovered this. This is actually one of the original examples that we discovered back in 2017. There was, in South Australia again, a series of explosions at one of our large gas-fired power stations, which led to voltages dropping very low right in the middle of the main capital, Adelaide, where there is a very large concentration of distributed PV. You can see on the right there where that fault happened on the transmission network, and the minimum voltage is recorded about 0.1, 0.2 per unit. In response to that, we saw a very large proportion of the distributed PV trip off. Within a 50-kilometre radius, it was about half of the PV that tripped, and extending right out to about 250 kilometres away, which covers a lot of the state. If that's not addressed, that can become a very major security problem over the longer run, with very large amounts of PV potentially disappearing. If you have a trip of a station, you can lose a lot of PV with it. So it increases the credible contingency sizes that we have to manage with frequency reserves and so on, and also has flow-on effects for stability limits and so on. So we initiated this process back in 2019 to improve our ride-through standards. We were informed a lot by the process that had been recently concluded with IEEE 1547, so we're able to draw a lot of learnings from that. So we then were able to get in place our new Australian standard 4777/2020. The challenge since then has been that only about 40% of the new systems being installed appear to be compliant with those new standards, which means that even though the new standard looks to be sufficient to define adequate ride-through, they're not being installed correctly on that new standard. So we still have essentially the same problem. We've managed to improve that to about 80% compliance just by working with the original equipment manufacturers who have enormous influence over the way that installers engage with their products when they're installed. And by setting defaults and removing old standards and making it much easier for the installers at the point of commissioning, they've been able to improve that compliance rate considerably. We also are working on improved governance around this to make sure that there is clear roles and responsibilities defined around who should be doing exactly what and checking exactly what when to make sure that that compliance is high. So I'd say this, if you only pick one issue to worry about and get right, it would be this one, because if you don't get this right, it flows on to an enormous number of other security problems and operational problems. But if you can get this right, then everything will go much more smoothly. Next slide, please. This example here is talking about an incident that we had just in late 2022. There was severe weather around the interconnector that led to a separation event and South Australia operating as an island. Because of damage to the transmission lines, it was operating as an island for about a week, from the 12th to the 19th of November. And that included operation through some periods of extremely high levels of distributed PV operation. We had to curtail this. This was using our ability to curtail PV in practice for about a week. And you can see on the right there the operational demand or the net demand levels that we were measuring for South Australia. The teal color is what was forecast, and the purple is the actuals. And you can see that we've trimmed off the troughs by curtailing distributed PV through the middle of each day. The dashed lines there are the targets that AEMO was instructing our network providers to meet. So we were curtailing off about 400 to 600 megawatts of PV throughout some of those really high PV days. The main security risk we were worried about here was while we were operating an island, there is the potential for a fault in the middle of Adelaide that would cause a trip of a unit plus a very large amount of PV disconnecting. And we didn't have adequate frequency reserves to be able to manage that in that island condition and maintain our frequency standards. So the only option we had available to us was to curtail down the PV. So it's harking back to the previous issue. If you can solve the disturbance ride-through issues in the standards, then this issue would be much diminished. Most of this response was delivered by the DNSP, our distribution network provider, through what they call enhanced voltage management, which they're using to increase their distribution voltages to about 1.03, 1.04 per unit to deliberately trip off PV generation in these periods. That was implemented as a last resort mechanism. It's obviously not ideal to be increasing distribution voltages higher than nominal, but it was a last resort mechanism put in place to deal with a lot of these legacy PV systems that didn't have any active controls. In this event, it was extremely effective. It delivered the response that we needed, and it absolutely was a crucial lever to have in our toolkit to maintain security in these periods. In parallel with that, we have attempted to put in what's called a smarter homes requirements, where customers appoint a relevant agent who manages their PV when required. That has been put in place, but unfortunately, we're only seeing 40% compliance. Again, compliance being the problem. The biggest erosion of response is from the systems not being set up properly at the point of commissioning. So SA Power Networks is working with their original equipment manufacturers to improve that response rate. Next slide, please. So just emphasizing again this point, we've been trying to put in place this emergency backstop capability, which you really do need this early. It's something that can be quite simple, and you really just need the ability to turn off very large amounts of PV if necessary in a security event. That's quite separate in my mind from the full integration of DER into markets. I know there's a lot of talk all over the place around dynamic operating envelopes and distributors being able to have this nuanced control in their distribution network limits and so on. Absolutely, we need to go there, but that's going to be a long journey to get that working properly. And well ahead of that, we've needed to have this relatively more crude and simple capability to just turn off bulk PV for a security issue. So, and that's helping us with a lot of learnings as well in working towards that more sophisticated capability. Next slide, please. Just to note also on visibility of distributed resources, it's crucial to have much expanded data sets to really inform all of the analysis that we're doing. It underpins the model development, checking that things are maintaining performance requirements, just understanding what they're doing on the grid. The example that I've shown here is a major incident that occurred on the 25th of May, 2021. In the southern part of Queensland, you can see where there's those red and black dots in the graph about halfway up the coast of Australia. We had multiple explosions at some coal-fired power stations that led to voltage dips on the grid. You can see on the right there the minimum per unit voltages that were recorded across different levels of distribution and transmission. And you can see in the bubbles on the left the amount of PV that we saw responding in different ways, with the blue systems riding through, which is the desired behavior, the black systems disconnecting, which is the undesired behavior because they're exacerbating what was a very severe under-frequency event. And the red bubbles are ones that were disconnected by under-frequency load shedding, which was triggered in response to this very severe under-frequency event, but in those places was disconnecting a lot of distributed PV as well as load. So we have another piece of work that's looking at how do we improve that under-frequency load shedding design so that it's not tripping off generation in an under-frequency event. To do this kind of analysis requires enormous new data sets. You need device level monitoring from a sample of inverters, which is how we produce that figure on the left. We need much improved monitoring of voltages, high-speed monitoring across the grid, and active and reactive power, which was data sets used to produce the figure on the right. And you need to know the installed capacity of PV at each transmission bus, which is highly non-trivial as well. Just 3 data sets that we have some patchy coverage, but we're working hard to try and improve those data sets because they're so crucial in underpinning everything that we're doing. Next slide, please. So I've given you a very brief taster of some of the work we're doing. A lot more information on our website if you just look for AEMO and DER operations. Thanks for having me here.
Jenny, thank you very much for your participation. We're going to move to Brian next. People, please, again, feel free to pose your questions in the chat. Hopefully Jenny can hang on through the end of our time here, but really appreciate your willingness to share your experiences here for the stakeholders in California. Maggie, there we go. We have Brian ready. Oh, I see you up.
Hi, Jay. And
Hi.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be, everybody. I'm Brian Hannigan. I'm president and CEO of Holy Cross Energy. We're one of 22 electric cooperatives here in the state of Colorado. My nexus to you all is that I am originally from Southern California. I've got family in the area, and for a long time I studied and worked in California. So it's a great pleasure to be back providing some input into the great things that are going on in my home state. I want to open up by associating myself and the folks here in Colorado working on DERs with all of the excellent comments that have been made so far, particularly the comments from the joint IOUs and from AEMO, from Jenny and her presentation a moment ago. We learn regularly as utilities from one another, and we're very quick to steal best practices and set aside those things that don't work. And so a lot of what we're looking at here in Colorado with respect to DERs learns a lot from the experiences around the world. If I can get the next slide. To put things in perspective, Holy Cross Energy is about 1/60th the size of Southern California Edison. So we are a primarily distribution operator that does own some transmission with roughly 60,000 meter delivery points, 46,000 cooperative members or customers. The key thing that distinguishes Holy Cross is that our communities that we serve in the mountains of Western Colorado, about 2 hours west of Denver on the I-70 corridor, there's some very scenic outdoor recreation focused communities, skiing, hunting, fishing, hiking, biking, you name it. Our members do it. And so they're very focused on climate change, and they've set for the cooperative as member owners a goal of achieving 100% carbon-free electricity in our supply by the end of this decade. At the end of 2023, as you can see there, we're up to 50%. At the end of 23, we had some new projects come online, which I'll highlight in a moment. that will take us in on an hourly basis during the solar production hours to anywhere between 75 and 95% carbon-free electricity in any hour of the day. And so we're beginning to live the fabled last 20% of decarbonization of the electric system that so many analysts and thought leaders have written and spoken about. So again, we're about 1/60th the size of the larger IOUs in California, but I think the challenges are common. They just may differ in scale. Next slide. So we laid out in 2019 a plan to get to 100% carbon-free power supply by 2030 and to become carbon neutral or better across our entire enterprise. So all scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2035. Investing in energy efficiency at a first priority, developing cleaner wholesale power supplies, investing strongly in local clean energy resources and DERs, and I'll say more about that in a moment, and then smart electrification. We recognize that our member owners, our consumers, are going to be placing PV on their rooftops of their homes and their businesses. They're going to be increasingly driving electric. They'll be using heat pumps for heating in the winter season, and increasingly due to climate impacts, cooling in the summer season, even though we're in the mountains as well. So how do we get those distributed resources to be grid friendly, grid compatible, and to actually see them as part of our overall power supply and our ability to run a reliable grid to balance the supply and demand for electricity in all locations and at all times? Next slide. So at the end of 2023, we took delivery of the 2 resources that were previously under contract in Eastern Colorado, a 150 megawatt wind farm. It's actually 200 megawatts. Our share is 150 of that. It's the Bronco Plains 2 project east of Denver. We also share with another electric cooperative 30 new megawatts of utility scale solar. And as you see below, we're already developing or have developed a variety of local resources within our own service area, again, in the mountains, in mountain valleys, particularly on customer sites at distribution voltage. You can see there the first of many what we see as part of our portfolio, solar plus battery storage projects that are deploying at distribution, which provide some very useful balancing to the resources that we're pulling from the grid, but also the resources that we are utilizing from our consumers, such that by the time we get into next year, 2025, our system will be mostly powered by wind and by solar, with a few other renewables in there, and the residual makeup of market power coming primarily from coal and natural gas. And the question for us, like a lot of those who are on the call, is how do we close that gap? And what role can distributed energy resources owned and potentially operated by our consumer members, what role do they play in helping us close that gap? Next slide. So one of the challenges that we've talked about for most of the presentations this afternoon, but one I wanted to show graphically, even on a small system, we are beginning to see the impacts, particularly as we look ahead to this year and beyond. We have our own version in Colorado of the duck curve. We call it the Sopris curve in honor of our local mountains that look a little bit like that peak there that you see in the middle of the day. The gray and the pink are residual power supply resources that we're currently making up from wholesale providers, including our balancing area authority, the Public Service Company of Colorado. Obviously, that comes with a cost, that comes with some optionality to it. And they themselves, both Guzman and PSCO as our wholesalers, have increasingly variable renewable resource powered portfolios. And so you can only imagine if we are a customer with net demands on the balancing authority, and we're not in an organized market. So in this case, PSCO functions as our functional equivalent to the CAISO in terms of being the balancing area authority. They are going to be increasingly challenged by distribution customers like us who are asking for more and variable power supply to balance our own needs as those change over time. In general, what you see is, as shown here, oversupply of solar during the midday, oversupply of wind during the overnight hours when demand is low. And then for us in the peaks, in the mornings and in the afternoons, we see undersupply there. So obviously long duration energy storage is a big deal, but also flexibility of demand as well as flexibility of supply when coupled with stored energy. Increasingly, we're seeing this on a locationally distributed basis. And so that again lends itself an opportunity for DERs. Next slide. So we very much believe in the power of distributed resources to minimize our needed upgrades to the distribution system. I think Quinn from the Joint Utilities mentioned this very clearly in their presentation. This is some work that we've done with RMI, formerly the Rocky Mountain Institute, that's based in our service territory, just to look at how one could take a very wavy net load profile represented by the dotted lines here with minima in the morning hours and in the peak solar days and maxima during the traditional peaks, similar to what Jenny showed for AEMO a moment ago. But this would be at a distribution level. How can we use plug loads and air conditioning and commercial heat and vehicles and all the things to manage that wavy net load profile to something that was more levelized and predictable, and frankly, happier from a distribution system operator standpoint, because our systems are built to run in steady state, and they are at their most reliable when they run in steady state. So we see DERs as providing important services to help balance the supply and demand, not just over time, but over location as well. And several of these points have been made previously by the folks here speaking previously. Next slide. So, and this is my last one, and I'll park on this for a little bit, because as we thought about reflecting on the operational requirements of running a higher DER future, and to put that in context, our high DER future, for us, that means 25 megawatts of behind the meter solar PV capacity on a summer peak load of 150 megawatts. We are deploying roughly 4 to 5 megawatts of solar plus an equivalent amount of capacity of battery storage every year through programs such as our Power Plus program that offers zero money down, 0% financing for behind the meter battery storage with a monthly credit in exchange for the utility's ability to operate the battery as a grid asset within certain agreed upon parameters in the contract with the customer. We're looking at expanding that to heat pumps, and we expect those to deploy quite quickly, given our community's desire for climate action and to move off of natural gas for heating. And we provide free level 2 chargers to any co-op member that wants them. The full rebate occurs in exchange for our ability to manage the V1G charging rate. And when bidirectional chargers become commercially available and integrated with our energy management systems, we'll be handing those out as well, and looking forward to bidirectional charging in the same way that we dispatch and communicate with the battery storage. So there are lots of things that are needed to accomplish that. As you heard a moment ago from Jenny, visibility, whether you're a grid operator at the transmission level or at the distribution level, is absolutely important, as well as situational awareness. One of the challenges that we found is outside of our normal prolonged interconnection process, according to some stakeholders, we're not able to know exactly where the DERs are being built and where they're being connected and where the upgrades have to occur. So if there's some way using data that we can detect the existence of a distributed PV system or a new battery that's been installed, we can reach out to the consumer and offer them participation in one or more of our voluntary pricing or programs. Secondly, fast, secure, and private communications infrastructure, especially in the rural areas. We are not putting in fiber like other cooperatives to provide last mile internet service to the house. We're putting in fiber to make sure that we can communicate with all the edge devices that are being deployed on our system, and to do so in a way that is fast and secure and private. And part of the privacy may occur in communicating directly with a meter or a grid controller at the premise that does all of the coordination and optimization, or as we've heard previously, orchestration of the DERs that exist behind the meter in a way that is somewhat blind to the utility, except for the net transfer of energy and services across the metering interface. so that it preserves the privacy of the consumer as to whether it's the battery or the vehicle or the heater that's providing those grid services. At some level, the utility, the distribution utility, really doesn't care what it is, so long as it provides the necessary services that are being requested. That leads me to the third point: grid responsive and, more importantly, interoperable hardware devices. In our early interactions with particular devices and vendors, we all are seeing a number of closed ecosystems with vendor-specific APIs that aren't able to interact with one another, and they may actually be tethered to operating systems that themselves are proprietary. But as we all know, you can't legislate or regulate consumer behavior, and there's no guarantee that a consumer seeking a battery is going to get the one and only vendor for which your DMS or your DRMS, your management systems, are able to converse. So a bigger industry-wide effort, both on the standpoint of consumers and utilities in their requests for proposals and programs and partnerships, but also on the industry itself to develop a single interoperable set of hardware interfaces, almost like a USB port for DERs, would be absolutely valuable and would speed the adoption and the integration of those DERs. When I say grid responsive, again, we're thinking about pricing signals, not unlike the Southern California Edison pilot project that looked at more dynamic rates. We're also looking at control signals. I will say that our early experience has shown more interaction and value with our member consumers when we pay them a monthly bill credit and reduce the on-tariff bill payment for the DER by the value of the grid services that they're allowing it to provide to us. Event-specific payments seem to be less effective based on our earlier example. I spoke a moment ago about software optimization platforms, and I put in parentheses there multiple levels. You see in the graphic the advanced distribution management system, which helps us manage the distribution system and all of the devices connected to it to enable the flow of power across the delivery function. That has to interact with the signaling mechanisms and the bill crediting for the DERs in a DER management system. And as I hinted at earlier, that may interact with a increasingly smarter meter that's not just capable of functioning as a cash register, but it's also capable as functioning as a microgrid controller that is able to operate and orchestrate the DERs even when it doesn't detect a line voltage on the high side of the meter. In other words, during an outage. We regularly hear from our consumers, I bought PV for energy resilience purposes. Why won't it work when the distribution grid is out? Great question. Something that when we think about ourselves as distribution system operators that provide energy services and not utilities that provide energy as a commodity, that motivates us to make sure that we keep the lights on no matter whether it's our grid, their grid, or a combination of the two. Lastly, I'll talk about innovative programs and equitable financing options. In our service territory, we have seen the uptake of DERs preferentially by those with the economic means to self-finance, those with the leisure time, I should say, to do the research. We have not seen them by the working poor and the service economy on which most of our service territory resides. So we look at a variety of ways to balance this playing field. Everything from on-tariff financing with no money down and 0% financing so that the consumer does not need to have discretionary capital in order to acquire the DER. They can pay for it over time with those bill credits added on for the services that it provides. We also are looking at graduated rebates and perhaps even different rate structures for those consumers who are income qualified. We have a very robust community solar program where if you're not able to install solar and increasingly storage as well, you can power your premise with storage and solar located in your community, in your neighborhood, at your HOA. And so there are opportunities to think about equity in that aspect. And then finally, the last bullet point not shown on the screen is the utility business model. And this again is where I'll come back to thinking about the utility as a distribution system operator as a deliverer of electrons from point A to point B in a world where every home and every business can be an independent power producer. It is no longer sufficient for the utility to rely on the commodity sales of kilowatt hours as a way of financing the investments in the infrastructure. It just simply doesn't work when people have the option to generate their kilowatt hours themselves, or in a state like California where community choice and competition are part of the fabric. And we see that increasingly becoming the case in states like Colorado. My last point is this, and that is our mental model of how we're operating our distribution system at Holy Cross Energy is that we are, to our retail customers of all shapes and sizes, the grid operator at retail, the same way that the CAISO or the AMO are at wholesale to their distribution system customers. They are the grid operator of the bulk power, they are the balancer, they are the reliability coordinator. At retail, at lower voltages on the network, that is our role. And so our whole business model really needs to be rethought in a high DER environment. And our incentive structure for Holy Cross, that's as a nonprofit, our key performance indicators, our performance-based regulation, our rates, our programs, you name it, really needs to be rethought for what that means in a high DER future. And that work is well underway, and we look forward to learning and sharing as we go on this last slide, shared clean energy journey together. And that's where I'll leave it. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Brian. First, thanks for your leadership and participation here today. We encourage everyone to continue with your questions, comments in the chat. Also, please feel free to continue to use the Slido app. We have that open. Encourage participation there. In the meantime, we're going to tee up our last presentation from Debbie Liu. And I know we have some questions in the chat, some to Brian and I think one to Jenny. Maybe if we can try and, if you guys want to take a look and tackle those while we go. Otherwise, we'll try and see what time's left over. Debbie, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jay. And thanks for inviting me. Really happy to speak with all of you. So I'm going to talk about considerations for really high levels of different types of DERs. If you go to the next slide. So Brian just mentioned that, utilities, it's great for utilities to learn from each other. ESIG, our group, Energy Systems Integration Group, brings together utilities to learn from each other, and really happy to be able to bring together people like Jenny and Brian and the other folks who are speaking to learn from each other as to best practices and solve technical challenges towards decarbonization. So a couple years ago, we had a task force looking at DER integration into wholesale markets and operations, lessons learned from the UK and Australia, and transitions to a high DER system. I know there's folks on the phone today, including Lorenzo, who will speak later, who are part of this effort, and encourage you to take a look at this link to access these reports. So if you go to the next slide, I was asked to talk today about operational needs, and I think everyone's sort of explained this already. It's really important to have visibility and to provide control. And so it's that look ahead, the monitoring, and being able to control that is what the system operator does every day. And we've already talked about the need to forecast loads and resources. We've talked a little bit less about positioning the system and then the real-time balance. But this visibility and an understanding of the behavior of the DERs, which I think will become increasingly more complex. I mean, today, if it's rooftop solar, that's pretty easy to forecast. Tomorrow, if it's behind the meter storage and different people have different use cases as to how they use their storage, then understanding the behavior becomes more difficult. And so I will also add that this visibility of the DERs, it doesn't have to be the CalISO role, it could be some other entity's role that could then feed the forecast up to the CalISO. And I won't go through this little analogy that I had because I know we're a little bit short on time, but I wanted to say that if we want high levels of DERs to be a big part of the balancing solution, we need them to be visible, controllable, and reliable. And the great thing about DERs is I can aggregate lots of small DERs and they can act just like a large resource. And I don't need to build some big, gigawatt scale resource on the transmission system. But the risky thing about DERs, and I think Jenny showed this really well, is that in aggregate, they can act just like a large resource. And so we need to be really thoughtful and consider what that behavior looks like. So if you go to the next slide, DER impacts could show up in things like reserve requirements. So for example, Jenny was talking about the common mode tripping of many megawatts of rooftop solar. And, if you're tripping so many megawatts that it's larger than the single largest contingency that you've planned for, this can have reliability implications more so than just small frequency deviations. In addition, large changes in DER consumption or generation can increase the need for regulation reserves. And just as an example, ERCOT has already seen large loads overwhelm the amount of regulation up and regulation down that they hold. Now, of course, large loads are not the same as DERs, but it just shows the implications of what DER aggregations acting as one resource can be. So system operators are always balancing cost and reliability. And some folks may argue and say, well, technically, maybe you don't need as much visibility. Maybe you don't need super accurate forecasts. Maybe AI is going to learn all of this stuff for you. And, technically that may be true, but you may also just end up paying more for reserves. And how much more is going to depend on what people are installing, how much and how they're operating it. And again, depending on different types of events, it could lead to reliability issues in the end. So having that visibility, having that reliability, and having that controllability for DERs is an important pathway towards cost-effective costs for ratepayers in the end. So if you go to the next slide, fundamentally, what we're talking about is, how do we manage the DERs? And prior to any management of DERs, so like that third category that Jill showed of, not managing DERs, we've got this natural diversity. And the natural diversity across loads is a great thing. So, this is why we can undersize equipment compared to, total nameplate rating of the loads. And you can see that here on the bottom left, 1 EV charging, you need its full nameplate rating, but you have 1,000 EVs charging, and you need much fewer kilowatts per car because of the diversity. Now, once we start managing DERs, either through prices like time of use rates or some kind of program, we can get big step changes in load. And we now need to manage those step changes or increase our regulation reserves, which comes at a cost, to handle them. And so as an example, this is from Green Mountain Power. It's their battery program that I'm sure, most of you already know about, how they use batteries, customer-sided batteries to shave peak. And they discharge these batteries to shave peak, but once they release the batteries all want to charge. It creates a big step change. So they limit charging to 15% for an hour after releasing the batteries. It's a kind of a crude way of managing that step change, but it is a way to manage this rebound effect. If you go to the next slide, this is Arizona Public Service. It's another method to manage these kinds of effects. So you're probably all aware Arizona Public Service has got 2/3 of their customers on a time of use rate. And this is a crude tool that shapes their demand, right? Customers have adjusted their behavior, or maybe they've set their electric vehicles to charge during off-peak. And those time of use rates help to sort of pre-shape the demand. And then in real time, if there's a need, APS can deploy their DER programs, which act as a precision tool. And they're aggregating their thermostats, the water heaters, pool pumps, et cetera. And this is just showing deployment of the thermostats during August 2020. Now they note they have to be careful about how they use the DER programs with the pricing. They're orchestrating their load shape in this way, but they don't want to dispatch the DERs to increase customer bills by increasing consumption during peak periods. So you can imagine there could be times when, peak time of use periods don't line up with real-time conditions. So they need to think very carefully about how these things interact. And I think this is going to become even more complex when we have, third-party providers involved in this as well. If you go to the next slide. Folks had mentioned earlier prices to devices. Again, I think at moderate levels, prices to devices are great. I think you get to really high DER levels and you need to think carefully about how the devices may act if they are responding to similar price thresholds. So, if you want to know what the system needs, it's not just price that gives you that answer. It is price and quantity. Right? So a price could be high, but if the quantity is small, if it's a shallow price, then having a large quantity of megawatts chasing that price could backfire on you. And this is just a graphic from ERCOT. They have some loads that respond in an open-ended fashion to real-time prices, kind of like a prices to devices kind of idea. And they have a concern that this could increase the need for regulation reserves, and also that if they had a lot of prices responding to similar price thresholds, that you could get oscillations in prices. If you go to the next slide, one way you can solve this is to dispatch a quantity to a price threshold that's expressed by the DERs. And this is just showing an example of controllable load resource programs where they treat load resources just like generators, right? They can bid into the day-ahead market, the real-time market, participate in ancillary services. They can set market prices. And this is just a way to think about this provides essentially like a reliability tool to the operator because it helps them balance both sides of the supply and demand at the same time. If you go to the next slide, another aspect of operational needs is behavior during disturbances. And Jenny already talked about this. I just wanted to point out, LBNL is looking into EV charging that can provide grid-friendly or grid-unfriendly behavior during faults, similar to what Jenny was just talking about with solar during faults. And there's more work, I think, that we need to do in thinking about how EV chargers act during disturbances. If you go to the next slide, DERs are like the Swiss Army knives of the grid. And, it's a great thing. We've already talked about this. I wanted to go down into the distribution system a little bit, and I've got one last slide. I realize I'm running out of time. If you go to the next slide, in general, I think DER value is going to be in reducing needs for generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure. And customer resilience is likely to increase in importance as we have more climate events. And I think coordinating services between the kind of transmission and distribution and the customer level is the critical piece of what we're trying to address here. And again, this is just looking at the Green Mountain Power battery program. Customers use those batteries for resilience during outages. And Green Mountain Power has to be careful to, when they dispatch the batteries, to avoid, to reduce their capacity requirements to ISO New England and also to reduce their transmission allocation charges. They have to be careful to hold a good state of charge for their customers in those batteries prior to potential extreme weather events, because that's what the customers need. And so they're very careful to make sure that, you know, the batteries are charged and before the customer needs that for resilience. And today, ISO New England is summer peaking. You know, those extreme weather events are likely to be in the winter time. So this works out pretty well. In the future, when ISO New England becomes winter peaking, this kind of coordination may become more difficult. And so trying to figure out how we're going to coordinate that between the transmission, the distribution, and the customer needs is going to be something we're going to need to work on in the future. And I think that is my last slide. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to thank our invited guests here. I know we're over our allotted time, so I think we're going to have to move into our break and onto the next panel. But let's please, we've had an active discussion and questions in the chat. So please, people please post more questions there or in Slido for our guests here, and we'll try and field them through the rest of the time. I know Jenny and Brian have been doing that already. So please, everyone, give a round of applause for our guests here. Thank you for your participation and your insights here. With that, I think we're going to move to the break. There we go.
Thank you, everybody. We'll take 10 minutes and we will be back at 3, I guess it's 4:01 for our Pacific Coast people.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's 4:01, so we are going to jump right into our next panel. If I could invite Amin from the Public Advocate's Office to come off mute and we can get started.
Great, I'm all ready to go.
Great. Maggie, if I could have you advance the slides. Great.
All right, so yeah, my name is Amin Yunus. I'm with the Public Advocate's Office at the California Public Utilities Commission. I'm a utilities engineer, and I'll be giving Cal Advocate's perspective on the operations needed for a future grid. Next slide, please. Okay, so before I get into the content of this slide, I'll just say as a little bit of background that we used what we think of as the grid architecture approach, which is to start with a vision and objective for the grid, work our way into the operations needed for the grid before determining the roles that those operations would be assigned to in a future at a future time. We also were influenced by the work of the Energy Networks Association, which is the UK's distribution and transmission trade agency. They've done a lot of work on this, and so a lot of the operations needed that I'll get to on slides, I think 4 and 5, are drawn from that research. And the last note is that it's clear at this point that the operations we have on these slides go a bit beyond the intended scope of this workshop. We have things related to planning as well. I'll probably kind of reduce the focus on those a little bit, but I'll still touch on them because I think they're still relevant and interesting. With those disclaimers out of the way, I'm going to start with what our vision for the future grid is. So we think there are going to be two really important things happening on the grid over the next decade or two. The first is significant deployment of DERs, and importantly, many of these DERs, such as vehicle chargers, space and water, heat pumps, and home battery storage, have the capacity to respond to remote signals. Those remote signals could be price signals, or they could be operational signals. So they could be some sort of operator turning the device on or off. At the same time, California's bulk power system is going to be contending with very high generation of variable energy resources. We're talking here, of course, about wind and utility scale solar. And as the penetration of those types of resources increases, you have, as this graph that is inspired by a plot created by NREL, I believe, shows we have this very non-linear increase in the cost and difficulty of integrating this. You have lots more short duration and then long duration storage required as the amount of penetration goes up. So if you'll move to the next slide, please. So we get to something very similar to what Brian Hannigan was just talking about on his slide from Rocky Mountain Institute with flexible demand, that there's this huge opportunity to shift demand from periods of abundant of low supply to periods of abundant supply. And of course, there's a little bit of a balance there, managing transmission and distribution constraints as well. But unlocking flexible demand is, in our view, going to be at the core of the high DER future. That said, the whole goal and objective we're looking at is a little bit broader. Flexible demand is a part of that and perhaps the most important part, but it's not the only part. So the goal that we articulate for the high DER future grid is that future grid operations and planning should provide the right signals to DERs so that they operate and locate when and where they maximize societal net benefit. I suppose for the purposes of this workshop, we're focusing more on operate versus planning and more on when they operate rather than where they operate. And that societal net benefit is split up into these 5 objectives. First, we have minimizing cost, maximizing safety, maximizing reliability, minimizing environmental impact, and maximizing equity. And I see I'm about halfway through my time here, so I'll try to speed up a little bit and we can go to the next slide. So with this, we're going to actually jump into the nuts and bolts of what we have today. These are the objectives that we have identified. These are intended to be exhaustive. I suspect that we probably didn't come up with every possible operation needed, but we certainly did our best. And the first operation, number 1 here, is the most nuts and bolts of all. That is operating the distribution grid. It's maintaining operational flexibility that we heard Devin Rouse talking about, maintaining voltage stability, maintaining safety requirements, shutting power off to a line that touches the ground. These kinds of very important but nuts and bolts things. At the same time, the bulk power system has to maintain grid frequency. Now that's really kind CAISO or WEC's responsibility, not so much the distribution operator, but the distribution operator can assist with this by providing inertia, whether it's real or synthetic inertia, providing generation capacity, and providing frequency response. Some entity or entities need to plan and procure the distribution grid. In the interest of time, and because this is, I think, out of scope a little bit, I'll skip over the details on that one, but it does have to be done. More pertinent to this conversation, I think, is going to be interconnection, which is bullet number 4. This one I show in bold is a little bit of a preview that this is where we think there is a key gap. I understand that's for the future workshop, so I'm not going to talk more about it, but those are the bolded ones are the ones we think are particularly important. Interconnection involves setting policies, authorizing interconnection, actually implementing the interconnection, so connecting it to the grid, and then most importantly, establishing the operating limits on DERs. So this is similar to what the I think Jose was talking about with limited generation profiles, that great work that's being done in the interconnection proceeding, but there's a symmetrical work that could be done on the energization side for loads. And then of course we have smart inverter requirements that we were just hearing about as well, setting the voltage ride-through requirements so that smart inverters aren't tripping offline, volt var responsiveness, things like that. Okay, 5 and 6 are also, I think, some very important operations. They're choosing when to operate DERs and then actually operating those DERs. And there are many ways that could be done. I could get home and plug in my electric vehicle, and that would be one way for me to choose when to operate that DER and then to operate the DER. Another option would be to have price responsiveness built into that EV charger and have the EV charger itself determine when to charge. And, a third option would be for me to sign up with an aggregator who determines when my EV is charged. And yet a fourth option would be for a utilities DERM system to decide when my EV is going to charge. These are all possible options to explore, but at the end of the day, some entity needs to choose how my car is going to charge. Actually, I don't have an electric vehicle, but if I had an electric vehicle, someone would need to choose when it's going to charge, and someone would actually need to execute the command to charge it. The next one we've had a little bit of talk in the chat on, but this is basically the information that CAISO needs. They need some information from the distribution grid operator. They need to understand load and what types of DERs and what the DERs are doing. I conceive of this as being relatively aggregated in the example below, but it doesn't really matter to me whether the CAISO knows a lot about what's happening or a little bit. That's the the distribution grid operator needs to convey that information to the CAISO. Next slide, please. And I think I'm really short on time here, so most of these are fortunately for me a little bit out of scope. Managing data access is really important, but I think that it's not exactly an operation, so we can skip over that one a little bit. Owning and funding the distribution grid and owning and funding in DERs. Again, these are important. These do have to happen in order to have a grid to operate, but I think we can agree that perhaps these are out of the scope of what Jay was talking about earlier. In scope is setting appropriate rates for consumption and generation based upon cost causation, and that is because those rates will affect when and how DERs operate, and that then inherently affects the operation of the grid. I'll skip over a little bit more down to system defense and restoration. We have cybersecurity, emergency load reduction, resiliency, and black start. These are core functions of the grid. A very interesting one here is emergency load reduction. We already talked about load shedding previously, and there's a potential to have a little bit more intelligence in the load shedding. So instead of an entire block or a distribution area being shut down, perhaps EV chargers could be curtailed at a certain time, or hot water heaters might be curtailed remotely in a much more equitable way that's sharing that load reduction rather than just certain neighborhoods going dark. Measuring meter data, again, needs to happen, and customers need to make informed consumption choices, so that information needs to be shared with customers in order for them to make informed choices about where to invest, what to invest in, and how to operate their DERs. They need to know those costs. Otherwise, they can't behave in a way that's optimal for them or optimal for society. All right, I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to wrap it up there.
Great. Thanks so much, Amin. Appreciate you. Next up, we have Samuel Golding representing the Utility Consumers Action Network. Samuel, over to you.
Thanks, Neha. I'm Samuel Golding, president of Community Choice Partners and consultant on behalf of UCAN. And I apologize in advance for presenting 20 slides in 8 minutes. So next slide. Okay, our recommendations today are based on the insight that best achieving the Commission's 7 objectives here is really going to come down to how quickly we can scale up relying on non-utility third-party investments in DERs, along with controls and services to orchestrate those DERs in ways that maximize use of the existing grid in order to displace and lower utility capital investments into the transmission and distribution networks. And credit where credit's due, that's less our unique insight and more the consensus view we see emerging across a lot of organized electricity markets grappling with these questions. The new operating framework this requires has several features that we're categorizing today as either market enabling systems, the new operating. What was that?
You're fine, Samuel. Go ahead.
Okay. The new operating system that tracks and orchestrates and compensates DERs, and also key market reforms, the new rules and business processes that enable load-serving entities and aggregators to provide innovative services to customers. Next slide. And one more. Okay. I'll hold off on explaining the 6 market reforms for time constraints. On the left, we're recommending these new platforms orchestrate DER services. It should be deployed on a statewide basis to function optimally, covering investor-owned utility territories and also including municipals that elect to participate. Each platform represents a function that's going to be necessary to create a rational operating framework and well-regulated DER marketplace. The data hub standardizes data exchange and communications. The DER register tracks what assets are deployed across the state, and the DER market platform actually facilitates the scheduling and trading of DER services and coordinating with CAISO. While we're presenting these as discrete platforms, in part because our slides highlight real-world examples, they actually need to be tightly integrated and could conceivably be deployed in California as part of a single statewide platform. Next slide. And one more. Okay, as context for the data hub, the current state of data exchange between utilities and third parties is very inefficient. It's very fragmented. And when you consider how enabling innovative third-party services will require expanding access across multiple utility subsystems, and also how data from third parties will need to start flowing back to inform market operations and utilities, it becomes apparent that we simply need a better approach to enabling data exchange that is standardized, efficient, and extensible. Next slide. This has given rise to this data hub concept where stakeholders establish a comprehensive model and format for all the required data, along with a single API that allows any entity to request and receive the data they're authorized to use. The data flows to and from utilities through a neutral platform operator, managing third-party registrations and permissions, instead of relying on each utility to do so for their respective territories. After deployment, the scope of data and the API evolves over time with stakeholder input to enable innovations and meet the needs of the DER marketplace. Next slide. New Hampshire has been developing a data hub implementation plan for a couple of years. It's recently become a proposal to DOE for a regional deployment across New England, and I'll disseminate an updated deck with links to that concept paper. Next slide. The second statewide platform or function, the DER register, the database tracking the grid location and capabilities of the DER assets, and keeps that updated. It's going to be increasingly critical, both for market operations and to enable accurate forecasting and planning. Next slide. The most well-known example went live in March 2020 in Australia. It tracks behind-the-meter DERs, and all the database documentation and technical specifications are online. Next slide. Okay, third and finally, the DER market platform actually schedules and trades demand flexibility and DER services across the distribution grid. It would allow utilities and load-serving entities to contract for flexibility services across different time periods, integrates with the DER register, keeps utilities and load-serving entities updated regarding DER availability up through the moment that the DER is dispatched, and then it handles settlements after the trading day. Over time, it would be expected to naturally evolve to coordinate with CAISO markets and transmission operations. Next slide. So a number of these platforms that have been commercially deployed already and are scaling across the EU and Australia. PeakLowFlex is an industry leader with over 60,000 DER assets and 19 gigawatts of flexible capacity in the EU alone. They're now beginning to deepen coordination with wholesale grids and transmission networks. This screenshot actually shows the flexible capacity solicitations that are live right now in New York, where National Grid has deployed the platform. Next slide. Okay, great, yes. So that brings us to our market reforms. To enable more granular balancing of supply and demand on a market-wide basis, smart meters and CAISO demand bidding and load settlements should shift to 15-minute intervals instead of hourly intervals. A further enhancement would be to permit 5-minute intervals for subsets of DER and demand flex customers. 2 points of comparison are that 15-minute intervals are used in Texas, and 5-minute intervals are now allowed in ISO New England. Next slide. In addition, going beyond the implementation of LMS compliant rates in 2027, we're recommending transmission costs be allocated to load serving entities for collection from retail customers. California utilities already allocate transmission costs to customer classes on a monthly coincident peak demand basis, and those costs could be allocated to LSEs on that same basis. This is already done in at least one FERC-regulated market in Pennsylvania, PJM territory, and doing so would provide CCAs and ESPs with a very significant additional price signal and an incentive to flex demand and DERs in ways that lower forecasted peak loads. Submetering protocols should also be expanded from EV supply equipment to also include inverter-based resources and smart devices. And that would allow more controllable loads and DERs to be exposed to dynamic rates, while non-controllable loads remain on the customer's otherwise applicable rate. We view this as a key consumer protection. It would really help avoid exposing customers to whole home bill shocks from any sort of high price events. Next slide. Those reforms would allow CCAs, for example, to deploy programs like the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative. Wow, what's going on with my slide there? That's odd. Well, I'll send around a fixed one. Okay, so in New Hampshire, the electric co-op forecasts the likely transmission peaks in multiple hours each month, passes the price signal through to sub-metered EVs, batteries, and water heaters, and customers are saving a lot of money each month by responding to those price signals, bypassing the transmission costs by shifting load off peak or selling power back on peak to lower overall network demand. Next slide. Authorizing supplier, one back. Thank you. Authorizing supplier consolidated billing would allow CCAs and ESPs to assume responsibility for presenting a single bill to customers. That includes the utilities charges, instead of relying on utilities to perform this function. And that would allow CCAs and ESPs to offer more innovative services and products to customers without being limited by what the utility billing systems can or can't support. So if you consider this in conjunction with our other recommended reforms, shifting to 15 5-minute settlements, shifting transmission costs to LSEs for collection, expanding submetering and creating a DER market where LSEs can monetize demand flexibility, this would position CCAs and ESPs to create a lot of new value for DER customers and in ways that make it easy for customers to participate and benefit. Next slide. As one example of what that could look like, this is Octopus Energy, a retailer, an ESP in Texas. Here, they've just rolled out a program where customers can lease an electric vehicle, authorize Octopus to handle all the behind-the-scenes managed charging services to lower costs. And the customer's experience is quite simplified. They just received unlimited free charging for signing up for this service. Next slide. Our last recommendation is for community scale distribution interconnected distributed energy resources. So it's like 5 megawatts and under, to be allowed to be counted as load reducers for CCAs and ESPs, including for lowering peak demand for transmission cost charges. These assets would operate under the CPUC's jurisdiction on the DER market platform, instead of registering as a supply resource bidding into the CAISO market. And so this would create a market in which CCAs and ESPs would be financially incentivized to contract for potentially significant amounts of new distribution interconnected DERs, which would then be intelligently dispatched at all the right times to maximize cost savings for customers and the grid as a whole. Next slide. And one more. Here's the Cliff Notes summary. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Samuel. And I know that was a lot of information to run through. So as a reminder, all the slides are posted on the Gridworks Future Study webpage for your review. With that, we'll move on to our next presenter. We have Sam White, representing 350 Bay Area. Take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Nia. If you move to the next slide. 350 Bay Area is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So we are commenting from both an environmental and a ratepayer perspective, meaning that we focus on the advancing state goals, including equity, affordability, emissions, and land use. We agree with a lot of what's been presented today, and we didn't want to repeat that. We want to offer more context. So next slide. So my focus today on the role of the electric grid in meeting our demand for energy, because functional roles determine operational needs. Next slide, please. An operation starts at load, working from the bottom up. To address the operational needs of the distribution system, it's important to first understand the core function of our electric grid, which is to distribute power to help or assist in meeting demand for energy equitably and cost effectively. Increasingly, as we've all seen and agreed, the system is no longer a one-way flow from substations to load, but a multi-directional, scalable interaction between energy resources and intermingled loads. At any location, we may find loads, generation, storage, communication control equipment, potentially capable of meeting on-site loads and even serving nearby loads, a miniature version of the grid itself. Next slide, please. And we see that illustrated here in ways we're all familiar with. Next slide, please. Operation starts at load. The distribution system connects all of this in a layered architecture, which is replicated at every junction, approaching a fractal design from homes, within homes, to the ISO. This is important because it means that each layer or node only needs to interact electrically with the rest at either end of its points of connection. Everything beyond those points can be treated as a single aggregation. You need to know what it's doing, but you only need to know its net impact at the point of connection or interaction. Next slide, please. So layered architecture focuses on the interfaces between layers. The operator of each layer doesn't need visibility or control into the assets within the layer below, only the activity at its interface. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This has the potential to greatly simplify operation and optimization because it allows operational data to reflect a single value at each junction. There's no need for a system to process all the details in real time of each component or each resource across multiple layers. Resources can be managed locally to reflect local constraints and available capacity, and within that capacity, serving the needs above or below. Next slide, please. This matters because demand is met through resources, and this starts with DER, because all demand begins where the load exists. DER includes loads and mitigations. It is the first layer in meeting demand and in mitigating the impacts of loads. And DER, both behind the meter and in front of the meter, includes energy efficiency, as well as demand response, distributed generation, energy storage, electric vehicles, and aggregations of these within buildings or microgrids of all sizes. Ultimately, less net load means less demand, which means less grid capacity costs at each layer. Next slide, please. So moving to the questions that were posed for this individually. Next slide. Efficient operation requires semi-optimal utilization of all available distributed energy resources. I say semi-optimal because perfection is not required. Utilization requires having enabling systems in place, that is, any available means for DER to receive or respond to information with reasonable timeliness and sufficient certainty. Information isn't the same as control. Information can be a signal or data, including tariff-based or live pricing or A and B data. Information can be stored or measured at the DER location and or communicated through any available medium. DER may react to data autonomously or respond to coordinated control signals. Coordination of individual DER should include layered aggregation of this data. Each aggregation is seen as a single entity in the next layer with a single net impact that needs to be responded to. This greatly simplifies operation and offers security over single point failure. Efficient operation means least net cost. Next slide, please. Briefly touching on economic opportunities, within the Smart Inverter Operationalization Working Group in the report that just was recently released, included in the packet, we focused on utilization of existing inverter functionalities, identified numerous high priority use cases and business cases based on technology readiness, cost, scale, and timeline. Beyond that, we also need to focus on standard tariffs and contracts which are needed, designed to support the stacked value of uses of resources. Traditional contracts and tariffs have often inhibited enrolling and utilizing DER for multiple purposes. A stacked value recognizes that any available capacity across all resources in an aggregate, instead of reserving each resource for a single role and leaving otherwise capacity underutilized. And we see the DSO, in whatever form that takes, as a nexus to simplify signaling in layered coordination, and to simplify potentially as a single point of revenue of access to revenue streams. Next slide, please. Focusing on a least net cost over time reduces ratepayer costs. Utilizing the full set of cost effectiveness tests, including societal cost test plus avoided cost calculator, and recognizing that each test has inherent limits, which must be recognized, including a pervasive failure to count future avoided costs. We also want to emphasize that inequitable energy burdens start with costs. Reducing costs reduce inequity. We've seen in the first estimate of the electrification impact study, a potential $50 billion cost for unmitigated electrification, and public advocates analysis shows that even the simplest mitigation cuts this in half. We've seen up to $120 billion in avoidable costs through optimization of DER operation in the next 30 years in additional detailed study. And separately, an additional $60 billion in potentially avoidable transmission costs in that same time period by 2050, because every megawatt hour needs to come from somewhere, and local resources reduce the need for additional upstream capacity. Savings require easy DER engagement and pricing of energy and services. Next slide, please. Obviously, grid resiliency, you can do a lot with local resources there, potentially even to the point of islanding at times. And we have enormous capacity that we've talked about coming today of already 15 gigawatts of rooftop solar, more than that potential in the future, an equally large or larger amount of front of the meter distributed generation, which is barely tapped yet today, flexible building loads. 80 gigawatts of EV battery storage deployed by 2030, which should give us about 8 gigawatts of flexible demand within that at any given time, bidirectionality. That brings us to the last, which is meeting state policy objectives. Next slide, please. Bottom line is it requires all of the above. The objectives are large, they're wide-ranging, they're focused on meeting the needs at each location. And the grid is what allows resources to be shared between locations, both locally and system-wide. We can only utilize these resources to help meet the needs to the degree that they're available, and DER are a huge resource. But that's our time, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. As a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can put those in the chat. And next up, we have Lorenzo Christoph from the Climate Center.
Okay, thank you. It's really good to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to participate. I'm representing the Climate Center, which is a nonprofit focused on climate safe California, their major program, and community energy resilience. Next slide, please. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, here I've just bulletized the 7 objectives that were in the question for today's workshop. And because in the second half of this presentation, I have a slide devoted to each one of these. Next slide, please. The punchline really of my presentation is that the needed structural element to address all of those 7 objectives is to create an open access distribution network and a transactive distribution level market or markets that enables all DERs on both sides of the end use customer meter to economically transact energy and grid services. I'll explain what that means and what the specific operational needs are, but just to explain, to motivate it a little bit, what I'm talking about is very much like what the ISO does on the transmission grid. It allocates use of the transmission system, it manages real-time operation, and it also conducts an energy market in which all of the parties can transact. And I'm thinking here and suggesting creating the counterpart to that, or the analogy for that, at distribution level. The idea of a transactive distribution level market provides lots of benefits in the sense of opportunities for customers who invest in DERs, as well as other third parties, to recoup some of the value of their DERs through providing services, and at the same time enables the system and society at large to get more benefits from those. It incentivizes private investment because of the ability to transact and earn revenues. And specifically, I want to point out that I'm talking about all distributed resources on both sides of the end use customer meter. A lot of today's discussion has talked about DERs as being customer owned, behind the meter, providing demand modification. And what I think has been largely missing from our discussions about the future grid is front of meter resources that become significant suppliers of renewable energy. We don't view the distribution system enough as a potential source of grid supply. So this transactive distribution level market will also encourage that type of investment. Once we accept this notion of creating this type of open access network and transactive markets, then the operational needs of the DSO derive from that, which include both the operations at distribution level as well as coordination with the ISO, as has also been emphasized today. Next slide, please. So here I'll get into a little bit more of the specific operational needs that are implied by that assumption of an open access transactive network. And these needs are really identified in a way by analogy to what the ISO does on the bulk system, but it's also about coordination. So first of all, defining grid services that DERs can economically provide. What would those be? What are the services that the distribution grid operator needs, as well as potentially trading energy? And as an example, compensating DERs and aggregators for flattening circuit level peaks, both load and supply, what I call the ducklings at circuit level, to increase hosting capacity without upgrading circuits. We heard today in earlier presentations, I'm thinking specifically of the ones from Quinn and Audrey, about electric vehicle charging and how that can be disruptive if it's not coordinated. Well, there's a service that can be defined that an aggregator could provide that flattens net load profiles at circuit levels or across transformer banks, and that reduces the need for upgrades and accommodates greater amounts of investment. It's these kinds of things that can be formally turned into services that are procured and compensated. Once you define the services, then the DSO needs to conduct non-discriminatory procedures for procuring, dispatching, and compensating the DERs. And the first sub-bullet under that is market mechanisms. What would that look like? So something like a day-ahead market in which the participating resources offer bids and the DSO accepts those bids and clears them, linked to an accurate, up-to-date model of the distribution network and current distribution system conditions. It clears those results, sends the results to participants. It will need real-time communication with the participating DERs because, as we know, distribution grid conditions can change fairly quickly. It needs to conduct solicitations for longer-term services and then accurately measure DER grid service performance and perform settlements. Once we have these services defined and they start to become predictable and they elicit the kind of investment we want to see in these services, then these services can become part of distribution network planning. Network planning often looks at worst cases. In other words, what happens with DER performance if it's uncoordinated and just responding to what customers want to use them for. If they're coordinated, then that really has a value as we plan the needs for distribution network upgrades. Next slide, please. So continuing operational needs, one of the things that will be required is to help the entities that want to do local investment in DERs, local governments, tribes, load-serving entities, DER developers, community-based organizations, etc. They need up-to-date network information so that they can plan and deploy DERs, not just to meet the needs of the customers or the communities where they're developing these resources, but also to optimally utilize existing grid capacity and to be of maximum benefit in providing grid services. The final major piece here is coordinating with CAISO operations and markets. I'm thinking both day ahead and real time at the TD interfaces. So if the DSO operates a market at distribution level and it clears that market in advance of bid submission into the CAISO day ahead market, that enables the DSO then to provide an accurate forecast to the CAISO of what's the expected net interchange across the TD interface. Similarly, in real time, the DSO could conduct a similar solicitation market clearing that's coordinated with the ISO market. Then as the ISO clears its markets, some of those results come back to the DSO to disseminate to the participating DERs. Another point that was raised earlier is about customer meter data and current distribution systems provided by the DSO to load-serving entities to support their CAISO bidding and schedule. One of the root causes back in the outage in August 2020, when the root cause analysis was done, was LSEs having difficulty forecasting their actual loads, much of it due to unavailability on a timely manner of end-use customer meter data, and then supporting direct participation in the CAISO markets through timely provision of system conditions and curtailment procedures. Next slide, please. Maximizing the benefits. So as I look at the future and think about DERs, DER cost and performance keep improving. They're getting more attractive while grid costs keep rising, which I think we need to pay attention to the potential for grid defection, which becomes increasingly cost effective given those trends. Unfortunately, it's going to be the customers that have financial resources, large businesses, affluent homeowners who are going to be able to do this, who will be incentivized to do this. But if we see significant grid defection by these customers, all of the inequities are worsened. So the open access transactive network is the better alternative. It rewards customers for staying connected and participating in the transactive markets. And it also makes DERs more accessible to more customers because it provides revenue opportunities that defray the investment costs. Next slide, please. Okay, almost done here. I won't be able to go all of these through, but there's a slide here for each of the 7 goals. And what I want to mention on this one is stimulating private investment. Once we start seeing community resources that are able to provide local energy to meet local loads, locating energy close to load to deal with growing electrification demand, the ability to transact is going to be crucial to that kind of investment. Next slide, please. Reducing ratepayer costs. It makes it commercially viable to deploy local supply to meet local demand, reducing the need for bulk system generation and transmission, as well as using aggregators and LSEs to coordinate DERs, flatten circuit and transmission load profiles, reducing de-investment needs. The longer term play here is that DERs reduce infrastructure investment needs and enables then ratepayers who deploy DER of their assets. Next slide, please. Increasing equity, here is an aspect that's not talked about enough, but these transactive markets, opportunities to recover investment costs means that more customers and communities will be able to own assets locally. Local ownership of assets is key to increasing equity and energy justice. Other things are good too, like rate support for low-income rates and so on. But it's really through owning assets that communities build wealth. And DERs enable communities to own assets that supply energy that can earn revenues once we set up the appropriate types of market mechanisms to enable them to do that. And I think I'll end here because I'm running out of time, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lorenzo. And yeah, Lorenzo has a handful of other slides here that are posted on the Gridworks Future Grid Study website. So please check those out when you are able. All right, our final presenter of the workshop today is Nikhil Vijayekar, representing the joint CCAs. Nikhil, welcome.
Thanks, Neha. Nikhil Vijayekar, I'm partner with Keys and Fox, and I am counsel to the joint CCAs, and I have the distinct honor of being the last speaker today. So I'll try to be quick. I think we've heard some overlap in the visions and objectives and even some of the concrete recommendations that today's speakers have offered, even if each of those speakers play a slightly different role with respect to a high DER grid. The community choice aggregators, whom I represent, have a unique role in that system, and that role is evolving. But I think it's fair to say that their vision and objectives overlap with what we've heard today, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation. So what I want to do is briefly provide the CCA's perspective on the scoping issue. I'll try to stay away from issues that other presenters have covered. I think in our view, a key sub-question that's kind of wrapped up in the scoping issue is, what do we as stakeholders need in order to ensure that a high DER grid involves DERs acting in grid beneficial ways that benefit all customers, right, rather than increasing system costs? So if you remember nothing else from this end of the day presentation, I hope you're able to remember the following two things from this presentation. The first is that CCAs today already run a wide variety of DER programs, and the number and the diversity of those programs continues to grow. And the second is that better data, so that means distribution system data, customer load and usage data, and program participation data, all of that can help CCAs drive more value. And Neha, we can stay on the first slide. I'm still there. Better data can help CCAs drive more value for all customers. That's bundled and unbundled customers from their programs. In other words, respond to some of the operational needs that we've been discussing today. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. So really quickly, I think many of you here know what CCAs are all about. They're local government agencies and they're load-serving entities. CCAs today serve over 14 million customers across more than 200 cities and counties across California. The basics are that CCAs receive generation services, customers receive generation services from their local CCA, and then they receive transmission, delivery, billing, and other services from the IOU. And CCAs want to provide value to the system, right? Benefit all customers, bundled and unbundled, and through their programs, their customers are in a position to do so. Next slide, please. So one of the CCA's key interests in this proceeding is to enable stronger CCA-run DER programs. And as I mentioned, today, CCAs already run many different flavors of DER programs, including solar, storage, EV, DR programs. And generally, these are self-funded programs run through generation revenues. And CCAs run these programs because they're responsive to their customers' needs and their community's needs, and because they accelerate decarbonization. And as a general matter, whether those programs involve solar or storage or EVs or demand response, today they're oriented towards wholesale market conditions. So they're oriented towards encouraging load reductions during peak hours when the grid as a whole is under maximum stress. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this in detail. It's a more in-depth summary of existing programs run by the joint CCAs. It's non-exhaustive. A lot of other CCAs out there running innovative DER programs. Just a couple common threads. One, these programs are incremental to what IOUs and other aggregators offer. They're generally structured as incentives for grid beneficial technologies and behaviors. They generally shift load away from peak hours, and they aim to help customers achieve savings. Now, the CCAs are innovating in program design and delivery, but that innovation can be better harnessed through better integration with distribution planning and operations. Next slide, please. So this is basically my problem statement slide, right? Which is transparency and data access, in our view, is a critical foundation that will allow CCAs and other entities to develop and deploy programs at the lowest possible cost. So again, we're talking about program participation data, load and usage data, but also distribution system data. Today, CCAs don't even know where their customers exist on the distribution system, let alone the constraints on specific circuits or substations to which those customers are connected. So at the highest level, better information on grid needs would enable stronger DER programs. Again, currently programs are being optimized based on bulk needs, which is fine, but that could cause localized issues. I think it was Quinn from PG&E that pointed out that local and system needs can be uncorrelated or even negatively correlated. So you only meet and orchestrate the needs of the energy system as a whole, then you could be exacerbating constraints on the distribution grid. So fundamentally, without a locationally informed price, we are risking inefficient behaviors, we're risking inefficient grid utilization, such as, charging EVs on a circuit while a circuit's peaking. So where does that leave us? Next slide, please. Fundamentally, better data and better signals, and that can be in many different forms, as I think Sam pointed out, that would help both existing and new CCA programs. As far as the existing programs go, better data would allow CCAs to optimize the dispatch of DERs around distribution needs. It could help reduce operational challenges such as voltage spikes or sags or congestion, and then ultimately defer upgrades and reduce distribution system cost. And looking ahead to new programs, better data would enable CCAs to target customer engagement, target incentives, drive adoption of DERs in areas where there is an identified grid need. And I want to point out, in both of these cases, the solution doesn't necessarily require that there be active utility control or dispatch. So I'll again wrap up just with some of the key things that I'm hoping you all take away from this. Next slide, please. The first is that CCAs are already running a variety of DER programs. Second is that under the status quo, CCAs lack enough information to optimize those DER programs around distribution system needs. And finally, there's an opportunity here, right? CCA programs can provide better value to all customers into the system with better information and signals that can incentivize solutions to those constraints. That's all I got. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Nikhil. And you finished ahead of time, which puts us right on time to close out for the day. Thank you all for staying with us for the last 3 hours and 50 minutes. I will try to make our closing brief so we can all get off the screens. As Matthew mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, if upon reflection, you go back and read, you have an amazing dream overnight about what the grid needs to incorporate high DERs, please email any of those additional comments to Maggie. Her email address is here on the screen, and it will also be available on the website. And please email those comments by February 22nd. Gridworks will pull together a summary of today's workshops, including any additional comments received. And we will distribute that by March 2nd. We'll also post that on our California Grid Study website. And this is just the beginning. As Jay mentioned at the outset, this is workshop 1 of 3. So our second workshop will be on March 12th. Same time, same place, 1 to 5 p.m. On Zoom, where we will consider, now that today we've come up with our wish list of all the operational needs of the future grid, what are the gaps between where we are today and what we need to do to get there? And finally, our last Slido ask of the day, we'd love your feedback on how the workshop went today, and if there's anything we can do to ensure that workshop number 2 is helpful and even better. I see a question in the a question in the chat asking if there's going to be an opportunity to comment on the summary. No, there will not be an opportunity to comment on the summary, but there will be an opportunity once the full future grid study comes out at the end of the 3 workshop series to provide comment on that study, and that will be part of the official CPUC record. Any other questions, comments, thoughts before we close things out for today?
Now, I was just going to check with staff from the commission or the commissioner or the judge if any closing thoughts or encouragement wants to be shared.
Just wanted to thank everyone. Great presentations. Going to go back and look through them some more and looking forward to the report on March 2nd.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right, hearing none, we'll leave this up for a moment so you know what are all the upcoming dates, and so you can get that Slido QR code and Slido link to fill out that feedback survey. And thank you all for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you at workshop number 2.
But it might move. I